Chapter 753. Bishop visits. After the philosophy class, Klein had a feeling as though he hadn't slept in 3 days. His mind was filled with names and concepts like skepticism, metaphysics, a priori and a posteriori, nominalism, Roselle socialism, existentialism, and positivism. If it wasn't because the original Klein had studied history, which included some mastery of philosophy, he doubted that he had the ability to last through the lesson. This wasn't his college lessons on Earth. They were one-to-one, making it impossible for him to sleep, daydream, or read novels on his cell phone when he didn't understand the content. Actually, Mr. Hamid was quite different from what I had imagined. He was humorous, candid, and extroverted. His lesson wasn't dull, making him unlike a philosophy teacher. He also doesn't possess the stereotypes of a Lord of Storms believer. Klein rubbed his temples, turned to leave, and walked to the staircase. He returned to the 3rd floor as his valet, Richardson, followed him in silence. During this process, he discovered that his servants were busy with their own duties. None of them were lazing about, and they would only stop when their employer walked past. They would bow and greet him, clearly indicating how well-mannered they were. Taneja is very capable when it comes to the arrangement and management of household matters after all. Klein walked through the corridor on the 3rd floor and walked to the half-open room. Before he walked in, Klein saw butler Walter hanging 2 double-barreled hunting rifles on the wall, making the interior have a raw and bold feeling. This was a decoration every tycoon's home had. It's very easy to get approved for a hunting license. A double-barreled hunting rifle is potent, enough to allow the servants to fend off any criminals who wish to burgle or kidnap me. After hanging the rifle up, Walter took 2 steps back and observed the hunting rifle. He then took out a golden pocket watch from his inner pocket. Pah! He opened the pocket watch and looked at the lid's interior. His stern, old-fashioned face softened significantly. Klein coughed gently to inform his butler before pushing open the ajar door and walked in. Walter closed the pocket watch, returned to his spot, and bowed. "Sir, we applied for 6 hunting licenses and bought 6 double-barreled hunting rifles and the corresponding canister cartridges." Klein had death knell hiding under his armpit, so he didn't mind it too much. All he did was nod as a form of acknowledgement. He then revealed a warm smile and asked as though having a casual chat. "Back when I saw the information from the Family Servant Assistants Association, I noticed that you already have a wife and child?" A butler was the assistant to the employer. He was a confidant that knew many matters. Therefore, establishing rapport with the butler was something every employer had to do. Klein didn't wish to be an exception. Furthermore, he remembered a Rhodes mentioning that butler Walter could result in additional developments. Walter answered in all seriousness, "Yes, back when I was a servant at the Viscount Conrad's manor, I had to have constant contact with a lady due to work. We began having feelings for each other, and under the goddess's watch, we walked down the aisle of marriage and ended up having a daughter. She's currently studying at a grammar school and wishes to pass the Backlund University's entrance exams. However, that's something to consider only 2 years later." Upon mentioning his wife and daughter, this unsmiling butler's tone unknowingly turned mellow. At present, all the churches were emphasizing the importance of family. It was to stem the stress and mental problems that arose due to the tide of technological progress. The only difference was that different churches emphasized different matters. For Evernight, men and women were equal as they helped one another in the family. For Storm, men were to work outside while women were to handle the family, to be the former supportive angel. For Steam, it was more about learning more and to have technology do more of the work. All of them had their strengths, and they complemented each other. Klein felt wistful hearing that as he said, "Ma'am Taneja seems to be single?" "Yes." Walter's expression turned solemn again. In modern society, male and female servants still do not enjoy equal treatment. I'm not referring to the salary, as a housekeeper is at the same level as a butler or butler assistant, earning £25 to £50 a year. Instead, I'm talking about a deeper idea and belief. The church is trying to change it, but there's plenty of resistance. After all, the goddess isn't the only belief in loan. He paused and added, "Male servants can get married, but if a female servant were to have a family, it implies the loss of her job or becoming the lowest laundress who's only a part-time employee that doesn't need to live at the employer's residence. All of these will change only when one reaches the rank of housekeeper. But this isn't something a young and inexperienced lady is qualified for." Klein didn't continue on the topic as he nodded gently. He then walked towards the reclining chair. At this moment, his gaze swept by the piled newspaper by the coffee table. His mind stirred as he paused, turned to the side and said to his butler, "I saw an advertisement on the papers regarding the sale of Backlund Bike Company shares. Find a professional lawyer and accountant to inquire about it to figure out the exact situation. Haha, I'm rather interested in this industry. If the price is right, I'll consider buying it." For a second, Klein thought of a problem. As a tycoon who had brought huge sums of money to Backlund to seek out better opportunities, it was impossible that he didn't pay attention to the sale of the Backlund Bike Company shares. Since he didn't know the prospects of this industry, he needed to hire people to gain a better understanding of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit his persona. Of course, I can also raise the price as a result, allowing me to sell those 10% shares at a higher price. Yes, I have to remember to just raise the price a little and not be too greedy. If I were to keep raising the price and it ends up back in my hands, I'll be crying. It would throw all my liquidity into it, and I won't be able to maintain my daily expenses. As Klein fantasized, he warned himself. Yes, sir. Walter didn't ask further as he directly agreed. At 4:35 p.m. Richardson knocked on the door and entered. He said to Dwayne Dantes, who was reading leisurely, "Sir, Mr. Maury Mocked and his wife Ma'am Rihanna, as well as St. Samuel Cathedral's Bishop Electra, is here to pay you a visit." Maury Mocked? That House of Commons Member of Parliament? Also, why would St. Samuel Cathedral's bishop be here as well? Klein thought and asked with a smile. Is there such a protocol? He had only attended 2 etiquette lessons and knew that at his stage, visits wouldn't be that direct. People would first send their butlers or servants to hand over an invitation or schedule a visit. Richardson habitually lowered his head and said, "Yes. It's because Mr. Butler informed the neighbors that you would be home in the afternoon for the next week when he was delivering your name cards and gifts. Under such a situation, neighbors who received your name card and have heard about you will observe the corresponding details. Not only can they send their servants to invite you over, but they can also pass by on the excuse of being out on an afternoon stroll from 4 to 5 to make a semi-formal visit. Oh, the ladies will wear strolling attire. Otherwise, it wouldn't be decent enough. And you can also invite them to have afternoon tea with you." Klein walked to the door and allowed Richardson to retrieve his coat to help him wear it. He then asked, "Then why would Bishop Electra be here as well?" This was what he really cared about most. The first question was to lead up to it. Richardson answered as though he had prepared an answer. "Bishop Electra was a guest at Member of Parliament Mock's house in the afternoon. They must have mentioned you while having a chat and decided to pay a visit by strolling over." His hands weren't affected by his talking. He skillfully helped Dwayne Dantes adjust his attire. Klein tersely acknowledged, and after Richardson went forward to open the door, he walked out. Soon, he saw the 3 visitors in a small living room on the 2nd floor. Maury Mocked was a classic Loanese gentleman. He was in his 40s, and he had black hair and brown eyes. He had a deep outline with a receding hairline. His face was a little thin and long. He was formerly in the military and had entered politics after being discharged. He started his career in Backlund until he became a member of Parliament of the Kingdom's House of Commons. He was a believer of the Evernight Goddess and a member of the new party. He was in support of improving the environment. His wife, Rihanna, was from a family of lawyers. She provided plenty of funding for her husband's political ambitions, and she was also a believer of the Evernight Goddess. Electra wore a black, double-breasted clergyman's robe. He looked to be 40, and he had deep, blue eyes and a thin face. He wasn't good-looking, but for some baffling reason, he was pleasing to the eyes. Klein had once met this bishop when he was donating money into the donation box. Upon seeing Dwayne Dantes appear, Maury Mock took 2 steps forward and chuckled. "I've been hearing for the past few days that a pious believer in the goddess had moved into Unit 160, and I've been wanting to visit. We happened to be taking a stroll today, and we took the liberty to visit. Please pardon us for our faux pas." Klein smiled and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. "At such times, the only thing we need to do is praise the lady. Praise the lady." Electra and Rihanna nodded as they drew a crimson moon on their chests. After exchanging pleasantries, Klein invited his 3 guests to take a seat. A maid hurriedly delivered some tea and coffee. Housekeeper Tanaja had already asked each one of them what they wanted prior. "Mr. Dantes, I heard you're a merchant from Desi. I wonder what business you were previously engaged in?" Maury Mocked asked casually before joking. "Your last name just makes me think of many things." He was referring to the protagonist's name of a particular best-selling novel written by Emperor Roselle. Klein smiled and humorously asked in return, "What kind of business does digging up treasure count as?" This was also related to the content of said best-selling novel. Without waiting for the Member of Parliament to answer him, he said the answer he had long fabricated. "I once had my own mine, but as you know, it will one day be mined out." Mining cities would also end up waning as a result. He was hinting that he was born in one of the resource-rich cities in Desi County. There, gangs were rampant, and there were many secret tycoons. If ordinary people were to attempt to investigate Dwayne Dantes' situation, it would take them at least half a year. Bishop Electra nodded in thought as he asked, "So, you chose to come to Backlund to seek out new opportunities? May I know who proselytized you into the church?" Chapter 754. Invitation. Klein had already walked through Bishop Electra's last question before, so he said with a sigh, "It was my father. He was a truly wise elder. Unfortunately, he passed away many years ago during an accident." When he said that, he infused the original Klein's emotions of losing his parents, him being in an alternate world with no home to return to, as well as the scars that resulted from his time in Tingen City. He sounded calm and wore a slight smile, but there was a sorrow that lasted forever that remained hidden deep inside. "I'm sorry for your loss." He must have entered the holy residence of the goddess, sleeping peacefully under her watch. Bishop Electra answered sincerely as he formed the sign of the crimson moon on his chest. Without waiting for Dwayne Dantes to respond, he looked at him and invited him. "There will be a moon mass the day after tomorrow for the deceased. It will help him sleep in the goddess's nation and receive eternal peace. I wonder if you're interested in participating?" The Church of the Evernight Goddess didn't have many festivals, and the most important one was Winter Gifts Day. The second most important was the Mass held during the full moon, also known as the Moon Massachusetts. The rest were just normal masses and prayers on weekends. However, different dioceses and different cathedrals had their own patron saints and angels which would have a corresponding special festival for them. "I would love to." Klein stood up and bowed, saying it from the bottom of his heart. This gave him the perfect excuse to interact with the bishops and priests of St. Samuel Cathedral, or even the diocese bishop. He had a firm foundation for entering particular regions in the cathedral. Meanwhile, he came to realize why the Evernight pathway was interchangeable with the death pathway. Both wielded the authorities of serenity, eternal sleep, and darkness. It represented the end and a destination. Following that, Maury Mocked didn't continue the topic regarding Dwayne Dantes' identity and background. It appeared as though he had only been asking in passing. He and his wife Rihanna began idly talking about their vacation experience in Desi Bay last year. Having filled the gaps on this by staying there for 2 days, Klein replied with a native tone as he shared his thoughts on the Desi specialty, roasted fish. During this process, he also pretended to unintentionally mention his hunting activities while he was doing business in West Balham, and how he was extremely familiar with the primitive forest over there. This was to build up the necessary foundations for the second layer to Dwayne Dantes' identity. Furthermore, West Balham was different from East Balham. The colonial factions from Lone and Intis were on par, allowing for frequent conflicts. Even the actively controlled regions would experience changes from time to time. To investigate the activity trajectories of a merchant or adventurer wasn't easy at all. This was even more so the case when Dwayne Dantes was likely using a fake name. As for his hunting experience in West Balham's primitive forest, Klein didn't randomly fabricate stories, nor did he plagiarize articles from the magazines or newspapers. He used what the Fog Sea's strongest hunter Anderson had previously mentioned regarding his glorious deeds as a blueprint. He drew on the details and abandoned the main storyline. What he fabricated was partially true and fake as well. Upon hearing the thick anacondas, man-eating fishes, and flowers which could capture their own prey in the forests, Rihanna would let out gasps from time to time, looking afraid but also eager to know more. As for the Member of Parliament and Bishop, they were equally interested. They often had to force themselves to interrupt Dwayne Dantes' description to ask about the details. "You really are an excellent hunter. Back when I was serving in East Balham, I never had the chance to enter the forest. I never expected it to be this dangerous." After this extremely dignified middle-aged gentleman finished his tales, Maury Mocked picked up a tiny piece of velvet cake and praised sincerely. "I wish to invite you to go hunting if there's a chance in the future." As they conversed, a maid had delivered the afternoon tea pastries. A male servant served them from the side. Upon hearing Member of Parliament Mock's semi-serious invitation, Klein replied with a smile, I'm already looking forward to it. After chatting a little more and discussing Backlund's pollution control, the three guests suggested they take their leave. As they had only acquainted themselves and weren't considered familiar with each other, Klein didn't retain them. He sent them to the door with his valet, Richardson. As he watched the bishop, member of parliament and his wife leave, Klein's smile slowly disappeared until there was nothing left. He was rather pleased with the progress he had made. Bishop Electra was directly related to the Church of the Evernight Goddess, which was the main goal for him to return to Backlund. Maury Macht was a discharged soldier and a member of parliament at present. Without a doubt, he belonged to certain military officer clubs, and he would be beneficial to his continued investigation of the Great Smog of Backlund. Next up, I should slowly deepen our relationships. Klein returned to the small living room and saw that the maid had taken away the remaining pastries and tea. He originally planned on having a little more. Regardless of the other types of food, the pastries and desserts in Lone, especially Backlund, were outstanding. As for the cook which Dwayne Dantes had hired, he was skilled in that. Even Mam Rihanna was filled with praise about it. Klein also agreed from the bottom of his heart. Retracting his gaze, Klein didn't say a word as he steadily walked to the staircase that led to the third floor. Before dinner, Butler Walter finally returned to the house and briefed him on the situation regarding the 10% of Backlund Bike Company's shares. "Sir, we are lucky enough. Someone had hired a professional lawyer and accountant to investigate the situation of the Backlund Bike Company, and they had offered a price to the seller before the advertisements were published. But in subsequent negotiations, the price exceeded the buyer's expectations. He had no choice but to give up. This way, we don't have to wait for the investigation report. We can directly hire that original team." Klein nodded and asked without hiding anything, "What's the current bid?" The buyer that gave up had offered £6,000 with a bottom-line price of £7,000. The seller didn't divulge the situation about the other buyer. However, from the feedback from various channels, it's at least £8,000. £8,000. Not too bad. Should I raise it a little more? If I were to raise the price a little and the other party just gives up, wouldn't it be awkward? Klein nodded slightly and said, "Give me the corresponding report. I'll consider it." After flipping through the report and having dinner to accentuate his extravagant but brilliant image as someone who did solid work, Klein turned his head to Richardson and said, "Prepare the two-wheel carriage. I'll be making a trip outside." He originally imagined that Richardson would ask him in surprise. A two-wheeled carriage didn't seem befitting enough, but to his surprise, his valet answered politely after flashing a curious look. "All right, sir." Submissive and never asking why. That's also considered an advantage. Klein sighed inwardly as he waited for Richardson to return to help him wear his coat. After getting on the two-wheeled carriage, he directly instructed, "Let's circle around the Backlund Bridge area and East Borough." Richardson still didn't ask about his master's motives and just got the coachman to steer the horses carefully. As the carriage passed through Sherwood Borough, it arrived in the Backlund Bridge area under the illumination of the street lamps. Klein didn't give a destination, and he only got the coachman to meander through the nearby streets. He leaned against the carriage wall, looking out at the streets. He saw pedestrians in old clothes, walking along with tired faces as though they were in a rush to return home for dinner after a hard day's work. Occasionally, there would be the ringing of a bike passing by. They were fast as they shot into the distance. In comparison, the rider's expression appeared more lively than the pedestrians. They seemed to beam with an indescribable sense of pride. It's an obvious difference in class. Although it's the difference between a technical worker and an ordinary worker, with the difference in weekly salaries of £1 to £2 to those with £1 a week. Klein slowly exhaled as he subconsciously looked up at the sky. At that moment, darkness had already completely covered Backlund's skies, but the smog wasn't too serious. One could see through them and see the twinkling stars. After the Great Smog, the management of the environment is improving by the day. However, the situation with the lower-class workers in the East Borough hasn't significantly improved. Although their salaries might be higher, and their working hours have improved, due to the large number of people surging in, prices have risen across the board, reducing the effects of the salary hike. The improvement in working hours have just gone from 15 to 16 hours to 11 to 12 hours. They're just fixing the problems with the greatest problems. As for the other problems that didn't rear their ugly heads, they're neglected. Yes, the kingdom is still undergoing reforms. Many things haven't been straightened out. Klein watched as his thoughts drifted until the carriage left Sherwood Borough. On the future, Admiral of Stars Katlia stood behind the windows in the captain's cabin, watching Frank Lee pushing wooden barrels into the shadows. He was putting unknown things into it before closing the lid. He's recently been researching the growth of plants in dark environments. Why did he suddenly become normal? Katlia frowned with suspicion, often worrying that Frank Lee would create some huge invention. I'll get Nina to ask later. Just as she had this thought, her spiritual perception was triggered. She turned her head to see a letter on her desk. As a faint smile curled on her lips without her realizing it, Katlia walked over, tore open the envelope, and unfolded the letter. She quickly read through it. There are 2 Obninsks that do not belong to the Church of Storms swimming north from Sonia Island towards the Abyss Maelstrom. Find the direct descendant of Abraham family. You did well. Abyss Maelstrom was the name of a dangerous area at sea, and not the Abyss. Abraham family. Katlia thought for a moment, and without any clues, she planned on asking at the next tarot gathering. The next morning, after divining again if he should raise the price again, Klein said to butler Walter, "Hire that team and continue the negotiation. My bottom line is £9,000. All right, sir." Walter then immediately said with an apologetic look, "Something happened at home, and I wish to have half a day off." "No problem. Do you need any help?" Klein asked gently. "Thank you for asking. I can handle it, and it's not too urgent." "I will first handle the matters regarding the share negotiation first," Walter said sincerely. Klein didn't ask further as he nodded and permitted him to take time off. After his butler left the room, Klein turned to look at Richardson and asked, "Did Walter meet anyone earlier this morning?" "Mr. Butler received a letter," Richardson replied without hiding anything. Chapter 755. Switchboard Receptionist. He received a letter? Didn't he say that something happened at home? Walter's family lives in Backland, so if there really is anything wrong, then they can directly come over via public carriage or a rental carriage. Wouldn't that be faster than sending a message by mail? With his salary and land in the countryside, he can definitely afford it. Klein nodded without a word as though he had just asked in passing. He slowly returned to the reclining chair, sat down, and began to seriously read the papers. Upon seeing this, Richardson didn't say a thing as he silently retreated out of the room and quietly closed the wooden door. After hearing the light click, Klein cast his gaze away from the papers and towards the door. He thought, "I've discovered another advantage of Richardson. He enjoys observing his surroundings, and he's able to notice information of value." Back when Bishop Electra was a guest at Member of Parliament Maury Mock's place, he was the first one to notice it from the balcony. However, this is different from a spectator. The focus is more on the event rather than the details. Walter's matter seems a little abnormal. Could this be the additional development Rhodes mentioned? Regardless, I'll first divine the matter. I don't want danger to come to me without me realizing it. With this in mind, Klein immediately entered the bathroom, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and arrived above the grey fog. Every time he appeared as the Fool, his inner shell beneath the grey fog would wear Klein Moretti's appearance. It wouldn't overlap with Sherlock Moriarty, Gairman Sparrow, or Dwayne Dantes. Due to the lack of necessary information, he could only divine about any danger that targeted himself. Therefore, he didn't use dream divination. He removed the spirit pendulum around his wrist and wrote the corresponding divination statement. Walter's abnormality will bring me danger. Holding the spirit pendulum in his left hand, Klein closed his eyes and entered cogitation as he muttered the sentence he had just said. After repeating it 7 times, he opened his eyes and saw the topaz spinning counterclockwise at a rather ordinary speed and amplitude. This also meant that Walter's abnormality wouldn't bring him any danger. But this can only mean that I might not encounter any dangerous trouble through this problem. In addition, there's also another possibility. The danger depends on whether I make the appropriate choice. If I were to rashly get myself involved, something that isn't dangerous might become dangerous. Klein interpreted the matter with his rich experience. Just as he put this matter on hold, he suddenly saw the crimson star that represented the hermit coruscate as it burgeoned and shrank. Does this mean that the payment for Scales of Luck is here? Klein was delighted as he immediately emanated his spirituality. He was left disappointed because Katlia was only requesting Mr. Fool to pass on a message to the hanged man. She didn't mention when she would close the deal with the world. There are Obninsks at the Abyss Maelstrom north of Sonia Island? Mr. Hanged Man is pretty lucky. At least he isn't like me, needing to enter the ruins of the battlefield of gods. Of course, Obninsks can be dangerous as well. It's not easy to use one for a ritual. Mr. Hanged Man might even need Sea God's help. Ma'am Hermit's request is actually to help find the direct descendants of the Abraham family. This means that Queen Mystic is rather aware of Mr. Door's origins. The Emperor had mentioned it to her? Klein began making connections from Catlia's words as he threw the corresponding image to the crimson star representing the Hanged Man. At this moment, Alger Wilson had just finished his reports and had passed the examination, allowing him to return to the Blue Avenger. When he saw the endless grey fog and heard the hermit's words, he walked to the captain's cabin with a deadpan expression, keeping his pace normal. Upon entering the room and closing the door, he came in front of an alcohol cabinet, took a bottle of Lanti-Proof, the most beloved drink of pirates, and poured half a cup. Alger immediately held the cup to his mouth and downed it like it was water. During this process, he kept his eyes half closed as though he was completely immersed in his own world. After drinking half a cup of Lanti-Proof, Alger put down the cup, wiped his mouth, and chuckled. Abraham family's direct descendant? This might be very difficult for others, with almost zero clues, but I can ask Miss Magician. Her teacher is one. Heh. Admiral of Stars still isn't aware of it yet. He quickly reined in his emotions and paced about, finally giving up on his idea and responded frankly to Catlia's request. Admiral of Stars won't only ask for my help. At the tarot gathering next week, she might announce this mission to everyone, and the others know that Miss Magician's teacher is a member of the Abraham family. There's no point lying about matters that can be easily exposed. I shouldn't jeopardize the possible transactions in the future just for some petty gains. At times, honesty is the best policy. Alger stopped walking as he reverently bowed his head and recited Mr. Fool's honorific name. Please inform Ma'am Hermit that she can directly ask Miss Magician for clues regarding the direct descendants of the Abraham family. After settling the request by Admiral of Stars, Alger took the initiative to mention his encounter during the night of the blood moon, and he inquired to Mr. Fool about whether the item that resonated with the ocean songster's beyonder characteristic was the Book of Calamity, and if the female holding the golden cup in the Coral Palace was Kohainam. Something like that happened. Queen of Calamity might really not be completely dead. It's likely that she had split her beyonder characteristic, splitting them into the Book of Calamity and the one in the undersea ruin. Yes, there might even be a third or fourth portion, but I've no idea where they are. Klein confirmed without any hesitation that the elf was Queen of Calamity Kohainam. This wasn't based on intuition, but a logical inference. He had once obtained the golden cup that elf Queen Kohainam loved, and a similar vessel had appeared in the dream. Elvish songster Ciatas knew of Queen of Calamity's daily trivialities, and she had quite a strong relationship with the angel, which strongly implied that she was an elf that attended to Kohainam. It was completely understandable that the beyonder characteristic she left behind resonated with the Book of Calamity on the night of the blood moon. With this in mind, Klein suddenly recalled a matter. He had given Kohainam's beloved golden cup to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina for her to bury in Ciatas's tomb. If Queen of Calamity really isn't completely dead, will the golden cup cause any form of mutation to the corpses of any elves close to her? Klein did a count of the time, and he discovered that he couldn't be certain if the golden dream had reached Sonia Island. After some thought, he calmly replied to the Hanged Man, "That's right." Following that, he forwarded the message to the Crimson Star representing the Hermit. After doing all of this, Klein conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow and made him pray. "Honorable Mr. Fool, please tell Danitz to pass on a message to Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards about the existence of any abnormalities between Elvish songster Ciatas's corpse and the golden cup." Phew. After doing all of that, Klein exhaled and threw the corresponding image to the specially labeled point of light beside him. He then returned to the real world and left the bathroom. Coming before his changing mirror, he looked at his gray sideburns and blue eyes as he curled up the corners of his lips. He knew that he had returned from being Mr. Fool to the mysterious merchant, Dwayne Dantes. Biome. Inside a primitive forest. Danitz, who was having a feast in a particular base of the resistance, suddenly trembled as he nearly choked on the liquid in his mouth. Although this wasn't the first time he was receiving an answer from the mighty fool, he still felt apprehensive and afraid. After he identified the figure and heard his words, he heaved a sigh of relief and knew that Gehrman Sparrow was getting him to do something. "Ask Captain? That's simple. The Golden Dream will be picking me up in a few days." Hee. Gehrman Sparrow isn't crazy, and he's even very sincere and reverent before the mighty fool. Danitz quickly relaxed as he leisurely thought. Meanwhile on the future Catlia, who had received a response that surprised her, muttered in silence, directly asked Miss Magician. Yes, she seems to be a beyonder of the apprentice pathway. She's actually related to the Abraham family? As I expected, she's not simple. Katlia considered a moment and decided if she ought to give the hanged man a new mission because she wasn't too sure if Miss Magician was willing to divulge clues to the Abraham family. Walter returned to 160 Buckland Street in the afternoon with a normal expression like before. He had apparently resolved everything easily. Klein didn't ask. He felt that their relationship hadn't reached a point in which his butler could be totally frank with him. Furthermore, the problem hadn't fully blown up before him in a way that couldn't be hidden. Time quickly passed as he had his lessons. The next evening, with the arrival of the full moon, Klein brought along Richardson and rode his high-end carriage to St. Samuel Cathedral for the moon, Massachusetts. He wasn't worried about the donation that would happen, because Miss Justice had paid him £1,000. He now had £2,186, so it wasn't too difficult for him to donate a few £100. It's only not too difficult. Klein sighed inwardly as he looked at the bell tower outside, left the carriage, walked across the square, and stepped into St. Samuel Cathedral. Chapter 756. Grand Mass. After waiting nearly 10 minutes outside the prayer hall, Klein and the other believers who were here to join the moon mass entered under the priest's lead. In the dark and serene atmosphere, they heard uniform and ethereal chanting. Full-faced above the land stood the crimson moon, and sweet it was to dream of themselves, of child and wife and parents, but evermore. Holy and rhythmic voices echoed in the prayer hall as the believers involuntarily quietened down, as though they had forgotten all their frustrations in life or the different challenges they faced in the real world. Under the guidance of a few priests, they found their seats. In front of the altar, Bishop Electra, who was in charge of celebrating the Mass, held the revelation of Evernight and began preaching. As this segment came to an end, the priests held up water and bread, and they began handing them out to Klein and company. This was the loving grace of Evernight, food that people both alive and dead could share. Having not had dinner, Klein naturally didn't waste the bread of average quality and the water in the cup. Then he saw candles light up on the altar, and under the darkness, they appeared like stars in the night sky, emitting light and warmth that eased one's heart. At that moment, Bishop Electra led the few priests and everyone in the choir to chant in unison. We look upward into the night sky, we tenderly say her name, Evernight Goddess. We know no other words except Evernight Goddess. May the goddess draw out from the angel chorus with the silent sweet to gather, and hold both within her right hand which is gentle. Goddess! If she heard us she would surely agree, smiling with purity at the dead. Come, rest and sleep well, my children. The empty voice filled with holiness drilled into every believer's ears. It felt as though all the spirits present were resonating in unison. As a sequence 5 beyonder, Klein felt as though his soul body was being cleansed as his spirituality naturally flowed out in comfort. Following that, a tranquil darkness seemed to appear before his eyes, a darkness without any sound. In the darkness, corpses lay there, their faces calm and at peace, as though they weren't dead and were actually in a deep sleep. Klein calmly traversed the darkness in a staid manner when he suddenly stopped and looked diagonally ahead. At a spot where moonflowers were silently blooming, there were a few people sleeping. They were the hatless Dunn Smith in a trench coat, old Neil who still wore his black classic robe, and the short Kenley, who worked hard to save up money. They closed their eyes in a relaxed manner as a faint smile appeared to show on their lips. Around them were erected tombs, each of them having the same word written on them, Guardian. Klein instantly closed his eyes as a holy and ethereal voice resounded by his ears. Cross your hands humbly, over your breast. Make the silent prayer, and shout from the bottom of your heart. The only escape is tranquility. Klein lowered his head, closed his eyes, and raised his hands up before crossing them before his chest. He then repeated silently, the only escape is tranquility. The only escape is tranquility. This repeated again and again until the prayer hall reached a state of extreme silence. Only then did Klein open his eyes again and rubbed the corners of his eyes. He slowly exhaled and glanced around him. With the light from the candles, he discovered that most of the believers were covered in tears without realizing it. Even his valet, Richardson, was constantly tearing up without wiping his tears. The moon mass is akin to a ritual with beyonder powers involved. Its effect is likely to make everyone's spirit resonate, allowing different people to see the deceased who they share deep relationships in the darkness. It relieves one's grief in order to obtain tranquility. Yes, this isn't an abnormality that's targeted at beyonders, so I can be at ease. To ordinary people, this might be an illusory outlet that's instantaneous. They would only believe that it's a result of the goddess's greatness, and not some extraordinary powers. Sequence 5 Beyonders of the Evernight pathway seemed to gain a significant enhancement in their control of spirits. Klein withdrew his gaze as he made a judgment. Right on the heels of that, he recalled the darkness and the deceased that lay amidst the moonflowers. Closing his eyes, Klein allowed his thoughts to drift. That dark plain filled with moonflowers, night vanilla, and slumber flowers is a manifestation of the goddess's divine kingdom? What does the source of danger in the nighttime inside that battle of the gods' ruin correspond to then? Klein gradually outlined the cold darkness and the fog that enveloped the sea on the eastern front of the Sonia Sea. In the fog, there was an ancient, pitch-black cathedral with a steeple. Ravens spiraled above it as though they were holding a memorial or were in grief. And around the cathedral were ordinary residents, simple wood huts, grayish-white mills, and indistinct figures. Logically speaking, this foggy scene that's intricately tied to the night and dreams should be formed from the aura left behind when the goddess slayed Annihilation demonic wolf. But it doesn't have any similarities with the corresponding divine kingdom. Yes, mortals can't pry into the secrets of deities, so perhaps the dark plains filled with flowers isn't the projection of the divine kingdom, but rather an outcome of the ritual. Seeing that the moon mass was coming to an end, Klein reached into his inner pocket and took out his wallet. Holding his wallet, he got up and entered the aisle, walked straight to the altar, and under Bishop Electra's compassionate watch, he walked diagonally over to the donation box. He tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion, drawing out the crimson moon before throwing in all his large denomination notes. A total of £300. At that moment, Klein didn't feel the pinch like the previous few times. He was in a very calm mood because he recalled the ritual old Neil had used to repay his debt. Back then, they picked up a wallet containing £300, all thanks to the goddess's blessings. Taking a step back, he drew the crimson moon once again, and he gave his spot to the donor behind him. At that moment, Bishop Electra walked over and said as he drew the crimson moon, "May the goddess bless you. May the goddess know about it. What I wish for now is to receive some teachings," Klein replied with a smile. Bishop Electra glanced at the prayer hall's side door and said, "If you don't mind waiting 15 minutes, I can explain the Bible to you in the library." "I would love that," Klein said with a warm smile. Bishop Electra immediately got a priest to lead Dwayne Dantes and his servant out the prayer hall through a side door as they circled around a spiral staircase to the nearby library. There was a huge bookshelf here, and on it were various books from the Church of the Evernight Goddess. There were tables and chairs lining the sides for priests and bishops to study and preach to the believers. 12 minutes later, Bishop Electra entered the library with a calming smile and saw Dwayne Dantes with his white sideburns standing in front of a bookshelf, flipping through a book with great focus. He exuded the vibes of a scholar. "What are you reading?" he asked with a smile. Klein snapped the book together and said with a self-deprecating smile, "The Revelation of Evernight. To be frank, although I'm a pious believer of the goddess, I've never had the time to seriously sit down and read the Bible due to my busy life." As he spoke, he didn't show any odd signs on his face, but he felt uneasy deep down. He was afraid the goddess would smite him with a bolt of lightning to reward this pious believer, Dwayne Dantes. Well, lightning isn't in the goddess's domain. Klein consoled himself. Bishop Electra smiled and took the Revelation of Evernight from his hands. "It's never too late to begin." Following that, he invited Dwayne Dantes to sit down beside a table and systematically introduce the Revelation of Evernight structure and the corresponding holy word. Richardson held his employer's hat and cane, and he stood a slight distance away, silently waiting to listen to the bishop's preachings. Time ticked by, when Klein, who appeared serious, suddenly felt his spiritual perception trigger. A scene outside the door naturally surfaced in his mind. This was an intuitive foresight that stemmed from a clown, one that had been enhanced by the gray fog. Outside the door, an elder dressed in a black clergyman robe walked by and headed for the nearby spiral staircase. He had lush white hair but didn't comb it, making him look rather disheveled. He had a thin face that made it appear as though he was bones wrapped in skin. He exuded a rather cold bearing, and his skin was abnormally pale. His eyes were a rare pure black. This figure quickly vanished from the door as the footsteps gradually sounded like they were coming from above. "A keeper. But it's not the one I met at the prayer hall. It's his turn today?" Klein paid attention to Bishop Electra as he wore a contemplative look over the Bible's contents. He wasn't surprised that a keeper would appear inside the cathedral and pass by the library at this time. This was because the sealing forces behind Cheney's gate would reach its peak at night. It wasn't suitable for living creatures to remain inside. Therefore, the keepers only entered at sunrise and left at sunset. It had just turned dark. I need to remember what day and date it is today. Later, with more information, I'll be able to figure out the keeper's rotation schedule. This way, I'll be able to act as the corresponding target at the right time. Klein reined in his thoughts as he listened attentively. Finally, he got up and bade farewell 30 minutes later. He smiled and said to Bishop Electra, "I'm wondering if I have the honor to listen to your preachings in the future?" "No problem." Faced with a tycoon who had just donated £300, Bishop Electra couldn't reject him. He even happily nodded. "As long as you come to the cathedral and I have the time." Klein didn't harp on the details to prevent any suspicion. He earnestly thanked him and left St. Samuel Cathedral with Richardson. He returned home before 8, and enjoyed dinner as he leisurely spent the rest of his night. Late at night, inside the master bedroom, the sleeping Klein suddenly opened his eyes. His spiritual intuition told him that someone had infiltrated his mansion. Chapter 757. Dream encounter. Someone has infiltrated the compound? Klein didn't immediately sit up. All he did was turn his body to the side and reached his left palm under his pillow. He secretly held death knell, and at the same time, he slowly spread his left hand open, preparing to activate creeping hunger. After knowing that it was difficult to find food for creeping hunger in Backlund, he had infiltrated the prisons in Desi Bay's Conant City, found an inmate on death row, and confirmed that there wasn't any mistake in the judgment before feeding him to the glove. The Rose School of Thought has locked onto me? No, it's impossible for them to be that quick. Besides, if it's them, they wouldn't just come but would wait for an opportunity. They will seize the opportunity when I'm passing by a secluded spot and strike so as to not alarm Backlund's official organizations. I donated too much money at the moon mass, causing criminals to target me? A generous tycoon who just came to Backlund from a foreign land is indeed an easy target. Of course, I can't rule out the routine investigations of the Nighthawks. As thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein heard a soft noise coming from the balcony in the adjoining half-open room. Right on the heels of that, there was the sound of a lock turning as the floor-to-ceiling window was pulled open nearly silently. Klein carefully listened and sensed the footsteps pass through the half-open room and into the corridor. After a pause, the footsteps walked towards the master bedroom before passing it, turning the doorknob to his valet's room. He went into the wrong room? Or could it be that he's here to find Richardson? Klein's heart stirred as he released his grip on death knell. He then reached out to the iron cigar case, which wasn't too far. After he removed the wall of spirituality, an illusory figure in a dark red coat and old triangular hat appeared beside him. It then walked into the full-body mirror. When Senor, the Wraith marionette, jumped to the glass window in Richardson's room, he saw a figure with orange-yellow skin, raven-black hair, and soft facial features walk out of the room. As for Richardson, he was silently sitting by the edge of his bed, his body leaning forward. His back was hunched up like he was fused into the darkness. Horror colored his face as he showed a weak and stumped expression. Finally, he fell silent. The person is indeed here for Richardson. His traits resemble that of someone from the southern continent. He's agile and skilled. He's likely not an ordinary person. This is a friend that Richardson got to know at the manor in the southern continent, or could it be a maternal relative? Richardson is only a valet with an annual salary of £35. What matter would need his help? Klein guessed as he used Senor's vision to observe. At that moment, he suddenly realized why Richardson was good at observation and often stayed in the balcony to size up any pedestrians. He was afraid of being found. I hope it's not too big a problem and won't affect my plans. I'll later divine the matter. If Richardson is unable to resolve the problem, I'll have to find an excuse to terminate his services. Seeing his valet lie back down, Klein pulled back his wraith marionette. Meanwhile, Leonard Mitchell, who lived at 7 Pinster Street, once again entered the fog-immersed Backlund. He had previously questioned the Daily Observer reporter, Mike Joseph, and received the news that Sherlock Moriarty didn't proactively involve himself in Lenevis's matter. Instead, he participated in a discussion after being hired. This made any suspicions regarding him drop drastically. If it wasn't because this detective had been slightly involved in Capham's matter, and how he had a close relationship with Emlyn White from the Harvest Church, Leonard Mitchell would have had thoughts of giving up the investigation to continue his search for Insanguil. As Sherlock Moriarty didn't have many friends at the Quelag Club, with one of them dying in the matter involving Prince Edisac while the other was reporter Mike Joseph. Therefore, Leonard only had one target left, Dr. Aaron Series. From the dossiers, this doctor was once involved in a beyonder matter of the monster pathway. After the item was swapped, he stopped being unlucky or having nightmares. His life returned back on track. Most people that Sherlock Moriarty know are involved in beyonder matters. This detective sure isn't an ordinary someone. As Leonard thought, he rang the doorbell in Aaron Series' dream. Upon entering the dream, he casually found a sofa to sit in and said to Dr. Aaron, who was opposite him, "Tell me in detail how you got to know Sherlock Moriarty." In the dream, Aaron didn't lie. He started from how Mrs. Mary had introduced Sherlock Moriarty into the Quelag Club, and how he was one of the recommenders. He continued until the detective suggested that he inform the Church of the Evernight Goddess's bishop about his abnormal matters. The truth is described in the dossiers. Sherlock Moriarty seems rather friendly towards the official Beyonder organizations, and he was endorsed by Isengard Stanton. Leonard glanced at the mustached Sherlock which Dr. Aaron conjured and retracted his gaze as he listened attentively. After Aaron finished recounting everything in detail, he said, "He headed to the south for a vacation, and he hasn't returned. I've been worried about him all this while. However, he's a detective filled with wisdom and a kind heart. I believe nothing bad will happen to him. I just wish that he can participate in the celebration of my child's birth." Perhaps. Leonard suspected that Sherlock Moriarty might never return to Backlund. He then politely bade farewell and walked out of Dr. Aaron's dream. After taking a few steps forward, he subconsciously looked back and saw that inside the house with a garden, blurry spherical lights that represented different dreams filled the entire space. Everything was fine. Was it a mistake on my part? I keep feeling as though something about me is changing. Leonard muttered as he turned to fly to Pinster Street. Everywhere he could see was covered in dense fog. The street lamps were gloomy and pale. Suddenly, Leonard stopped flying as he cast his gaze at a building. In that house, there were about 5 spherical lights floating in silence, making it look different from the other buildings. However, Leonard's spiritual perception told him that there was apparently a black blob in the house which could absorb all light. Furthermore, he discovered that he didn't recognize the street he was at. He felt alarmed, suspecting if he had seen something he shouldn't see. He hurriedly retracted his gaze as he prepared to leave and head for his residence. At that moment, the building that looked ordinary sounded with a teasing voice. "Why don't you come in for a cup of tea?" Thoughts erupted in Leonard's mind as he flew up at high speeds without even thinking. In his spiritual perception, the terrace houses lining the back, the garden, and tiny buildings were burgeoning in size as the windows and doors turned into mouths that were biting at him. The nearby black street lamps were extending in height, making the surroundings appear like a forest of steel that seemed to stop Leonard. Leonard didn't stop or turn back. He felt a chill down his back as it became more obvious and deeper. His body slowly stiffened as though he was being grabbed by countless invisible hands. Just as he felt that he couldn't hold out any longer, he saw a familiar house where a familiar window and lights stood. He held his breath, plunged down abruptly, and fell back into his dream. Phew! He jolted awake and found himself drenched in cold sweat. Old man, what did I actually encounter? Leonard retracted his legs from the desk's edge and asked with a sense of lingering fear. The slightly aged voice in his mind replied after a few seconds, "I'm not sure." Leonard's eyelid drooped immediately as he didn't pursue the matter. He then cast his gaze out the window and saw lights everywhere in the Backlund night sky. It was tranquil. 160 Backlund Street. Inside Dwayne Dantes' mansion. "Sir, Ma'am Heisen is here." Richardson entered the room and said to Klein. Klein put down his papers and looked up, glancing at his valet. He discovered that he was still an apprehensive man of few words, silent and reserved. There was nothing odd with him. If it wasn't because the divination outcome was okay. Suddenly firing an employee will incur suspicion. Klein silently mumbled. He stood up as though nothing had happened, and he got Richardson to help him wear his coat. 15 minutes later, he was holding his etiquette teacher, Warana Heisen, in an embrace as he began to learn another common dance used at social events. "I feel as though I'll be losing my job in a few days." After a while, Warana praised Dwayne Dantes for his progress. When she was done, she added, "However, you're still a little restrained. Although you don't have to act like intis men who cling closely to the ladies, you don't have to constantly maintain a distance. It's very normal to make occasional contact. The way you are behaving now makes you appear rigid and dull. Klein pulled her in a little and replied with a smile. I was afraid of being rude. Does this mean that being too close to ladies is an act of rudeness? It also implies I'm full of charm, and that he might embarrass himself if he's too close? This is quite a euphemistic form of praise. Warana thought and said with a smile, You have learned well. The dance continued as Klein looked at Warana Heisen's face as he asked warmly in a casual manner, Ma'am, you seem frustrated? Warana lowered her head and chuckled. It's nothing serious. My husband is a businessman, and he recently had some minor conflicts with some people. We can resolve the matter. Oh, your question was too direct. Before both parties have established a friendship, it's best not to ask about their matters, unless she has made it obvious. Compared to you who comes and goes in families of high society. Thus, knowing many madams and ladies, as a tycoon who just arrived in Backlund, I do lack the necessary social connections. Klein nodded gently and said with a smile, I thought we were no longer strangers. He then skipped the topic and began talking about his own experiences and his neighbors. Warana would mention a few things in response, allowing Klein to better grasp the traits and preferences of his neighbor. After Warana left, Klein stood at the door for some time before turning to say to his butler, Walter, find out what trouble Ma'am Warana is facing. If she can't resolve it, we will provide her with some timely assistance. Chapter 758. Efforts will ultimately pay off in the evening. Klein, who had just returned from St. Samuel Cathedral, was just about to enter the dining hall on the second floor when he saw butler Walter walk over and say with a polite bow, Sir, the matter you wish to be investigated has been completed. Klein didn't inquire further in front of the other servants as he staidly nodded. Let's talk in the study. Walter followed behind him and came all the way to the third floor. Richardson then opened the door and lit the gas wall lamp inside. Klein unhurriedly walked to his desk, sat down, and looked at the butler for the report. As Walter gestured Richardson to guard outside the door, he approached the desk and deliberated over his words. After the door closed again, he said, Ma'am Wahana's husband is a cloth merchant. He had been cooperating with someone and had invested £1,000 into it, but the other party ran off with the goods. She has already sought the help of Member of Parliament Mocht and Ma'am Rihanna to urge the police department to crack the case as quickly as possible. However, the police usually doesn't dare to guarantee that they can find the target for such cases. Klein picked up the black fountain pen on his desk and stroked it. To Ma'am Wahana's family, £1,000 isn't a small sum. Based on what he knew, an ordinary home tutor didn't earn more than £150 a year. If the employer provided boarding and lodging, the salary would be even lower. Although Warana served high society and had many employers, her annual income capped out at about £400 to £500. Furthermore, a large amount of her expenses would be spent on her dressing, posture, and looks, to prevent her employers from finding her unfitting as an etiquette teacher. Yes, her husband's income as a cloth merchant can only be considered average. To him, a £1,000 investment is a rather huge investment, Walter said by mincing his words. It's a lot for me too. Klein sighed and smiled. I just came to Backlund, so I'm not very familiar with the police. Walter immediately replied, Sir, back when I was under the service of Viscount Conrad, I knew a few members of a Backlund High-Ranking Police Officer Association. Backlund High-Ranking Police Officer Association? That would be the most important members at Civilau's Yard. Even the chief superintendents who are in charge of an entire borough might not be qualified for induction. Civilau's Yard referred to the Backlund Police Department. It got its name from the street it was located at. As expected of a butler who served under a noble family. Klein sighed inwardly as he smiled with a shake of his head. There's no need to do so for the time being. On this aspect, I'm sure Ma'am Warana is able to seek the help of many people. Be it Member of Parliament Mocht or others, all of them have the ability to make Civilau's Yard place importance on the case. He paused and deliberately said in passing, I've seen the lower rungs of society, and I know their methods of survival. At times, the police might not be as useful as gang members or bounty hunters. Walter, go to the police department to retrieve the corresponding details and head over to the famous bars in the Backlund Bridge area and East Borough to commission a bounty mission. Regardless if they find the corresponding criminals or the batch of cloth, I'll be giving them £200 in return. Heh. Let's hope that those cheats had chosen to remain in Backlund. A reward of £200? Walter repeated the sum as he couldn't help but steal a glance at his employer, as though he found it unbelievable that he would offer so much for Wahana's matter. He turned agape and was just about to say something but ultimately kept silent. All he did was seriously reply, "All right, sir. I'll give you this money directly." Klein slowly got up and took out his wallet. As Walter received the thick wad of cash, he asked in thought, "Should I tell Ma'am Warana?" Klein smiled. "There's no need." Enlightened, Walter nodded with a bow. "Your generosity will spread through this street." Eastborough, Dharavi Street, in a cramped but lively pub. Zio, who had seriously combed her short blonde hair before heading out, squeezed through the area filled with men that stank of alcohol and putrid sweat and arrived at the bar counter. She tapped the counter and asked the bartender, "Any new missions today?" If it were anyone else who asked without ordering any drinks, the bartender would have ignored them, but upon recognizing Zio, a bounty hunter who no one wanted drinking, he could only sigh and say, "A very handsome reward, £200. £200? Zio nearly suspected that she had heard wrong. Apart from Miss Audrey's missions, she had never seen such a handsome reward in Eastborough or the Backland Bridge area. Even the mission to seek out Isaac Eggers that drove bounty hunters crazy had only offered £150. For an ordinary bounty hunter, completing a commission like this was enough for them to not work for a year. To Zio, it was equally important because she had been helping the mysterious man in the golden mask over the past few months. She had learned that the man was from MI9, and she was trying to earn enough contributions to exchange for the interrogator potion formula. Therefore, the reward she received when completing his tasks only paid a little. Most of it was exchanged towards her contribution goals, so all her savings came from the advantages that her sheriff sequence had given her to capture criminals. Once I receive the potion formula, I still have to spend money to buy the Beyonder ingredients, and I only have £300 odd. Furs is right. Money isn't omnipotent, but it's sufficiently important. Upon having this thought, she looked at the bartender and asked cautiously, "What's the mission?" "Who commissioned it?" "Find a few cheats. They cheated the victim of cloth costing £1,000. As the bartender handed the details to Zio, he said, "The person who commissioned the mission looked like a butler. He called himself Walter, and he's in service of a Mr. Dwayne Deities from Backland Street. If you capture the cheats or find the cloth, you can head there to retrieve the bounty." Zio quickly flipped through the documents as something quickly formulated in her mind. She instinctively knew the direction in which to continue the investigations. "I'll take this mission," she said immediately with a nod. The bartender shrugged and said, "You aren't the only one. All the bounty hunters have taken on this mission. Besides, they have other ideas." "Like what?" Zio asked out of curiosity. The bartender chuckled. "They say that since Mr. Dwayne Deities is so generous, they're willing to recommend themselves if he lacks a bodyguard. However, they later gave up on the idea since being a bodyguard isn't as free as being a bounty hunter. Even having drinks will have to wait until they're given time off." "That's not a problem for me, but I can only be a bounty hunter." Zio nodded, jumped off the high stool in front of the bar counter, and didn't waste time heading for the door. The next day, just as Klein finished breakfast and was preparing to head to his garden to have a stroll to aid in his digestion, butler Walter came in from outside and silently followed behind him until there wasn't anyone around. "Sir, there are 2 matters that need your attention," he said politely. "2 matters?" Klein was somewhat surprised. He thought that there would only be one. Walter nodded. "Yes, the first matter involves the 10% shares in the Backland Bike Company. Someone has already offered £10,000. Sir, do you still wish to continue in the bid? It has been raised to £10,000. Not bad at all." Klein deliberately acted stumped as he thought. "I'm new in Backland, and there are many things that need me to hold back on. Let's leave it at that." "All right, sir." Walter then said, "The cheats who scammed Ma'am Wahana's husband of the cloth have been captured. The bounty hunter has already arrived and requested payment." "That quickly?" Klein turned his head in shock as he looked at his butler. If he had taken action himself, he was indeed capable of settling it that very day. After, he had dowsing rods seeking to find people, but the problem stemmed from the fact that most bounty hunters weren't seers. "Yes, perhaps it's a Beyonder good at tracking and searching for people." Klein made a preliminary judgment. Walter answered in confirmation. "Yes, it's much faster than I imagined. According to that bounty hunter, she did a reverse search from black market sales before finding the cheats. The black market peddlers gave in so easily? From the looks of it, they must have been taught a lesson with the fist. Klein nodded and said, "What's that bounty hunter's name?" "She's quite capable. She calls herself Zio," Walter answered truthfully. "No way." Klein almost stumbled. Thankfully, he had the impressive balance of a clown. After calming the upheavals through his heart while acting calm, he deliberated and said, "Keep the bounty hunter's contact method. Perhaps there might be a chance to gain her assistance in the future." "All right, sir." Walter didn't find any problems with Deities' instructions. Any decent member of high society kept some unofficial means to their chests. Klein didn't continue on the topic of Zio as he tersely said, "How much was reclaimed?" The cash and the yet-to-be sold cloth from the cheats came up to about £850. Walter had apparently anticipated his employer's inquiry on the matter and had asked ahead of time. "Very good," Klein nodded and said. "After paying the bounty hunter, help her send the cheats and the goods to the nearby police station." Northborough Police Station. Warana and her husband Bacchus looked at the high-ranking inspector in front of them as they asked in unison, surprise coloring their voices. "It's been found? They've been caught?" The high-ranking police inspector smiled in response. "Yes." When he informed them how much cash and cloth was left, Warana and Bacchus heaved a collective sigh of relief. They could afford £150 in losses. Furthermore, the remaining cloth still had space for greater appreciation and profit. In essence, they hadn't suffered much of a loss. They repeatedly thanked the inspector until someone invited Bacchus to identify the goods and criminals. Warana sat there without losing her etiquette. She smiled at the high-ranking inspector and said, "Your efficiency has exceeded my expectations. I'm very curious as to how you found the bunch of cheats." Being aware that this beautiful and elegant lady knew a member of Parliament of the House of Commons, and that she would eventually learn the truth, the high-ranking inspector didn't hide it from her. In fact, it was completed by a bounty hunter. She investigated the black market of stolen goods and quickly caught the suspects. "You even offered a bounty?" Warana seemed to gain a full understanding of the whole story. The inspector shook his head and said, "No, someone beat us to it. He offered £200. £200? Warana asked in surprise. That wasn't a small sum of money, and it even exceeded the expected profit that her husband would earn from the sale. Seeing the inspector give an affirmative reply, Warana couldn't help but ask, "Who was it that offered the bounty?" The bounty hunter didn't say, but accompanying her was a gentleman dressed as a butler. The inspector simply described Walter's looks. Warana vaguely guessed at the butler's identity as she leaned back slightly, muttering softly to herself, £200. In the afternoon, Warana, who came to Member of Parliament Mock's house to teach his daughter etiquette, first thanked Ma'am Rihanna for extending their help. After the blackish-green-haired Rihanna said a few words of humility, she asked, "Warana, I heard that you're Mr. Deities' etiquette teacher. I wonder what kind of person he is?" Warana deliberated and said, "He's a true gentleman. He's warm-hearted, generous, kind, educated, gentlemanly, and very knowledgeable." Rihanna nodded slightly upon hearing that before turning to look at her proud daughter and chuckled. "Unfortunately, he's a little too old, or he might make a good match. Well, I plan on inviting him to our ball this weekend." Chapter 759. First dance Saturday night, 8 p.m. Klein rode his high-end carriage and arrived at 39 Buckland Street, Member of Parliament Mock's house. In 2.5 minutes after stealing a glance at the lit fountain that was sloshing with water, he buttoned his tailcoat and walked down the carriage before strolling to the house's main entrance. Richardson held an exquisitely packaged bottle of Southville red wine and followed closely behind his employer. After walking through the main door, Klein instantly saw Member of Parliament Mock and his wife, Rihanna, walk over to welcome him. The former was wearing an olive-green army officer uniform with an orange-red sash around his waist and a few medals hanging from his chest. In the Lone Kingdom, serving and retired officers enjoyed wearing their military uniforms at balls. The latter was wearing a yellow long dress with frilly sides and rarely seen, exquisite lace, making her look different from unmarried ladies. However, she also partially exposed her fair neck and her shoulders. Klein took the bottle of Southville red wine from Richardson's hand and handed it to Member of Parliament Mocked before saying with a bow, "Sorry, I'm late by a few minutes." This was actually a common situation at lone balls. Guests would rather be late by a certain amount of time than be early. This was because the masters of the house might still be busy with the final preparations with the ball. It was the worst time for them to entertain guests, but of course, one had to ensure that they weren't late by more than 10 minutes. If Warana hadn't specially taught him this, Klein would have definitely come early as a form of respect. It's fine. The ball hasn't officially begun. Mocht glanced at the Southville red wine as he handed it to his valet before nodding with a smile. At Lone's high society engagements, one had to bring a gift for the master if it was their first time attending a ball. Alcoholic beverages were the most welcomed, but one had to keep in mind that the first gift had to be something locally produced. After greeting Mocht, Klein looked towards Ma'am Rihanna and saw that she had slightly raised her right hand. Hence, he took one step forward and lifted her palm and bent his back to kiss it. You illuminate the entire ball. Before the ball began, complimenting the masters of the house was a necessary step in Lone's social events. And unlike Intis, Lone's hand-kissing etiquette required the lady to gesture that it was possible before a gentleman could do the kiss. Otherwise, it would be a serious faux pas. Likewise for your arrival, Ma'am Rihanna replied with a smile. Then the couple led Dwayne Dantes through the corridor and into the main hall where a pleasant tune was echoing. After taking a few steps forward, Maury Mocht pointed at a lady in a sky-blue dress. My daughter, Hazel. Klein looked at the girl as his pupils suddenly constricted. He knew this girl. To be precise, he had seen her image before. Back when he had asked a Rhodes where he could obtain a mystical item which could steal the beyonder powers of others, the magic mirror had indicated a scene of an arrogant lady loitering in the sewers, and she was none other than Hazel Mocht. She was a lady with wavy black-green hair and bright brown eyes. She has a mystical item that corresponds to a fire bandit? With her family conditions, why would she be loitering in the sewers? Is it some fortuitous encounter of hers? Was she searching for something or waiting for something in the sewers? She has already become a beyonder? How did she become one? Could it be that she has a grandpa parasitizing in her body? Klein, who was donning the skin of Dwayne Dantes, instantly thought of many questions, but he pressed his hand to his chest as he bowed with an unperturbed look. Good evening, Miss Hazel. During this process, he stole a glance at Hazel Mocht's face and discovered that she wore a composed look. There was an arrogance in her eyes, and all she did was smile politely and answer, Good evening, Mr. Dantes. She didn't have any abnormal reaction, which means that she's unable to sense the aura of the gray fog. At the very least, there's no grandpa parasitizing her. I can't be certain for now, and I'll have to continue observing. Klein stood up straight as he took a cup of pale gold champagne from a waiter's tray. He then began chatting with Member of Parliament Maury Mocht. I never expected you to be a major. He could tell from the epaulette on Mocht's shoulder. If he was a colonel, Klein would have even suspected if the gentleman was also a beyonder, but it was hard to tell for a major. Haha, it's nothing. There are many opportunities to render meritorious services in Balam, Maury answered. Of course, the weather there is especially unsuitable. I've always been suggesting to the army's higher-ups to design a uniform for West Balam and to get rid of the traditional dark colors. Otherwise, the officers will only feel as if they are beef waiting to be roasted. As for the enlisted soldiers, most of them wore red tops and white bottoms. Yes, the weather there is completely different from what it's like in the country. Even Desi Bay isn't that hot. Klein indicated that he had been to the southern continent, and he had been to either East or West Balam to corroborate his hunting experiences that he had mentioned a few days ago. After a few minutes of small talk, Mocht apologized and walked to the staircase with his wife. At the second floor, he raised a cup of red wine while standing by the railings facing the main door and said, Thank you everyone for coming to our ball. First, let us toast the deities. They are the source of everything beautiful. He and Ma'am Rihanna tapped 4 times on their chests as they softly praised the goddess. The other guests also praised the deities they believed in via their own means. Mocht continued having his cup raised as he said with a smile. Second, a toast to the kingdom. It is a stable bedrock. To the kingdom. Klein raised his cup of champagne and spoke with the other guests around him. Following that, Mocht surveyed the area and asked humorously, Finally, what shall we toast to? Klein's mind whirred as he said loudly with a smile, A toast to the improvement of the air in Backland. Mocht was taken aback as he couldn't help but smile in response. Excellent. That's a great suggestion. A toast to the improvement of Backland's air. This is a symbol of us living better lives. Cheers. The fixing of the atmospheric pollution issue had always been one of his political ideals as a House of Commons Member of Parliament. He had ultimately been pushing for the corresponding bills, and he had played a significant role in the improvement of the environment. Therefore, toasting to the improvement in Backlund's air was equivalent to toasting to himself. It was more euphemistic and more aboveboard. All the guests echoed in a spirited burst as they finished the drinks in their hands. Right on the heels of that, Member of Parliament mocked held Mam Rihanna's hand, and they went down to the hall. They then started the opening dance in the mellow music. All the gentlemen present began finding their first partners to dance. Klein took another cup of champagne as he leisurely sized up the guests. Mam Mary is here as well. He swept his gaze and found someone familiar. As one of the major shareholders of the Coim Company, with a wealth amounting to tens of thousands, Mam Mary had formerly hired Sherlock Moriarty to investigate her ex-husband's act of adultery. She's a member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, so it's normal that she has a close relationship with the Member of Parliament. Klein didn't attempt to invite her to a dance, since he here as Dwayne Deities. He didn't know this lady who lived in another street. He retracted his gaze and looked elsewhere. He saw Hazel mocked holding a cup of white wine and standing to the side. She wore a clear smile of alienation as she watched the gentlemen lock onto their targets to invite them for a dance. This lady actually looks pretty good. She's dignified and pretty. She should have been the star at this ball, with people yearning to invite her to a dance. However, the way she exudes that look of arrogance, looking down at people with a supercilious look, makes any gentleman who cast his eyes on her shift over to another target. I've seen this look in the eyes of certain beyonders as well. They no longer think of themselves as mortal, and they often have a sense of superiority when facing ordinary folks. Heh. This implies that Miss Hazel is likely a beyonder. That's right, if she isn't a beyonder, how would she dare to loiter in the sewers? She's from the Marauder pathway? But how is she to act as a marauder or swindler with such arrogance? It's hard to imagine. Seeing that the hosts were almost done with the opening dance, he began seriously considering who he could invite. Dwayne Deities is in his early 40s, so it isn't appropriate to invite a lady for his first dance, unless it's someone confirmed to be a junior. And the first dance of most mams would be done with their husbands. I should be able to invite people I'm familiar with or the hosts. Klein swept the dance floor and found the only lady Dwayne Deities was familiar with. It was his etiquette teacher, Warana. Invite her? No, she likely already knows that I've secretly helped her. To invite her for the first dance can easily make her misunderstand. It might even affect her relationship with her husband and incur unnecessary trouble for Dwayne Deities. It's not like I'm Emperor Roselle who has a penchant for the wives of others. No, he has a penchant for everything. In short, I should avoid creating gossip. Klein shifted his gaze and heard the music change. It went from a mellow melody to something brisk. It was a piece of countryside music that was popular in Central Lone. It was well liked by nobles and was often used for the first dance. With the change in music, the gentlemen walked to the ladies and madams they had selected. Klein also noticed that no one approached Hazel mocked. She's one of the hosts of this ball. Besides, I can observe her at a close distance. If she really is a beyonder of the Marauder pathway, it implies that the gray fog is able to converge beyonders from the neighboring pathways of the seer pathway. Klein wore a gentle smile as he unhurriedly walked to the arrogant lady. Miss Hazel, may I have the pleasure of a dance with you? Dwayne Deities with his white sideburns gave a standard bow as he said. Hazel glanced at him and after a few seconds of silence, said, "It will be my honor." She then extended her palm. Klein politely held her hand and entered the dance floor as they began a brisk and lively dance. Glancing at her beautiful but deadpan face, Klein said with a smile as he tried probing, "I just noticed that many young gentlemen wished to invite you to a dance, but they were unable to muster their courage." Hazel looked up and swept her gaze at him and said, "Mr. Deities, that's not a polite topic." Klein choked, lost as to how to reply. Chapter 760. What a small circle. I thought she would contemptuously say that she doesn't like immature and incapable men, hinting that she isn't impressed with ordinary people. Who knew she can't even be bothered to answer this question? This sense of superiority will easily lead to a loss of control for subsequent advancements. Klein couldn't help but lampoon inwardly. From what he knew, beyonders were only humans who had additional powers. It was equivalent to having plenty of money or status. In fact, they were still considered human and had no way of escaping human society. Only by reaching sequence 4 would one experience a qualitative change. Furthermore, Most demigods continue being active in human society. Even the sequence one snake of fate will accept in as being an obedient unborn fetus. Perhaps only at the level of blasphemer Amon and the others will they be able to view the real world as a god. Klein's mind whirred as he said, "I'm sorry. I was once a merchant who often spent time in the northern continent and southern continent, and I have had little experience with a ball. Haha, I mean this type of ball." "It's fine," Hazel replied calmly as though she didn't care about the topic he had just raised. If it were anyone else, they would have been at a loss for a conversation with this arrogant lady. All they could do was focus on the dance, but Klein was considered quite a knowledgeable and experienced person at this point. He knew quite a bit of the different beyonders in the mysterious world, so with his apology, he said with a smile, "This is a challenge that isn't simpler than the sea. It similarly has beautiful scenery but hides countless difficulties. Of course, the sea also has stories of all kinds of treasures. Some of them are clearly fake, but others sound rather realistic but are impossible to verify. It's just like Death's Key that's ranked first amongst them." "Death's Key?" Hazel looked up at Mr. Dwayne Dantes, who was a lot taller than her. Indeed, a beyonder with a strong sense of superiority would often have their interest piqued when it's something that involves mystery. Klein chuckled inwardly and he nodded gently. Yes, it's rumored to be hidden somewhere in the Berserk Sea. He used the legends he had heard back when he was aboard the White Agate, as he added more of the details he had heard during his career as an adventurer. During this process, he couldn't avoid mentioning the 4 kings and the 7 pirate admirals. Hazel was clearly interested in these as she responded to Klein in a rare instance. She would even occasionally ask other questions, making the dance between them less awkward. Without realizing it, their dance came to an end. Klein skillfully ended the topic and switched to asking, "Do you plan on returning to where you were, or do you plan on heading over to get some food?" After a dance, the gentleman had to abide by the lady's wishes and send her to where she wished to go. It didn't have to be where she originally stood. Hazel opened her mouth as though she wished to ask further, but she ultimately didn't speak further. She nodded her head in a reserved manner. "Where I was. Hee. She clearly misses the stories at sea. She's just a big brat. As long as you grasp her temper and find what interests her, she's actually not difficult to interact with." Klein held back his smile as he sent Hazel back to the periphery of the dance floor where she previously stood. As for him, he acted casual as he walked to the long table that had all kinds of food placed on it. He picked up a plate and began to scoop a serving of pan-friend dragonbone fish, and he matched it with some sliced black pepper steak. Compared to the dance and entertaining others, food is the true essence of a gathering. As Klein thought, he worked hard at trying to make his appearance while eating appear elegant enough. At this moment, he saw Ma'am Mary walk over and fork a piece of foie gras soaked in red wine onto her plate. When Klein saw her glance at him, he politely smiled with a nod as a response. "How may I address you? I haven't met you before at the balls and banquets hosted by Member of Parliament mocked." Perhaps it was because of Dwayne Dantes's grey sideburns and deep blue eyes that were very charming. The ordinary-looking Ma'am Mary with slightly high cheekbones took the initiative to ask. Klein laughed and replied, "I'm a merchant who just returned from Desi Bay, Dwayne Dantes. I live on this street." "Ma'am, do I have the honor of knowing your name?" Mary nodded in thought, and she roughly understood this man to be a merchant who was trying hard to enter high society, just like she was previously. She said with a smile, "Mary Schott, Coim Company's executive director." She didn't mention that she was the biggest shareholder of the Coim Company, or mention that she was a member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. This was a loan-styled euphemism. Mary Schott. She has taken up her original last name? Right, she has already divorced. Klein silently thought to himself and said with a smile, "I know of this company. Its main business is in anthracite and high-quality coal. It has expanded rapidly in the past few months. To be frank, I have the intention of investing in it, but I don't seem capable of competing with the rest." After the atmospheric bills were passed, there was a drastic increase in the demand of anthracite and high-quality coal. Coim Company managed to develop itself in ways that exceeded its past efforts. Its overall valuation had already exceeded £250,000. Klein wasn't shooting his mouth when talking about investing, but that he believed that this industry would become even more important in the coming years until humanity found a resource to replace it. Mary had always been very proud of the National Atmospheric Pollution Report she pushed for, as well as the development of the Coim Company, so she couldn't help but smile when she heard that. This is because people are beginning to pay attention to the environment that they are living in. Having said that, she gently sighed and said, as it gets better, trouble also increases as a result. Having just acquainted himself, Klein didn't ask about the trouble. With his prior acquaintance with Ma'am Mary, he easily found a topic of interest and had a good conversation with her. Haha, her attitude towards Sherlock Moriarty and Dwayne Dantes is very different. Despite being someone she knows, just a change in looks and identity will be given a brand new form of treatment without any problems arising. This feeling is truly magical. As they chatted, Klein felt wistful as he felt that the additional faceless potion he had consumed was quickly digesting. After a few minutes, a handsome man with bright blonde hair walked over with a cup of red wine. He smiled at Ma'am Mary and said, "Mary, what are you talking about?" "Hibbert, this is Mr. Dwayne Dantes from Desi. His experiences at sea and Westbalham are truly interesting." Mary immediately introduced the two. "Dwayne, this is Mr. Hibbert Hall, the eldest son of the Earl of Eastchester. Haha, we should be calling him Lord, but he prefers people to address him as Mr. Chief Secretary. He's the Chief Secretary of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. I've heard you mention him before." Of course, that was when the identity, Sherlock Moriarty, was still active. The Earl of Eastchester is a major noble in the nation. He's considered the top brass when it comes to high society. Klein politely bowed without appearing overly low. "Please permit me to convey my thanks as an ordinary citizen. The work of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council has allowed us to live in better living environments." Hibbert Hall was rather pleased with such sincere gratitude, so he smiled in reply. "This is all thanks to the hard work all of us have put in." "By the side," Mary said with a smile, "Dwayne, don't mention such matters again. You will make Hibbert arrogant." "No, I was just joking. He's more humble than all the noble children I know. He should be having a vacation in the Eastchester County's fief at this time and spending his time hunting with his friends. But he immediately returned after I sent him a telegram informing him that I was invited to this ball by Member of Parliament Mocked. It's not only for this ball. There are many things that require my attention. My father, Earl Hall, would also frequently commute between Backlund and our fief before June," Hibbert seriously explained. "A gentleman who places great importance on his social image." Klein made a preliminary judgment. When Mary heard that, she asked in passing, "Is there anything still keeping you back? When are you leaving Backlund?" "Most of my work has already been completed. There's only one matter left. Haha, my sister, Audrey, is very interested in the Backlund Bike Company's 10% shares. She hired a specialized team to help her in the negotiations, and I'm responsible for overseeing the matter," Hibbert said without much thought. "Backlund Bike Company's 10% shares? What a coincidence. I have to say that the circle of high society is quite small after all." Klein sighed inwardly as he deliberately mentioned, "I also found a team to attempt to purchase the 10% shares, but I only managed to offer up to £9,000. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to compete with the other competitors and could only give up." Hibbert glanced at him with a look of surprise. "You have good taste." He didn't mention how much his side's bid was, to prevent his competitor from participating again. £9,000. Mary silently muttered, realizing she had underestimated Dwayne Dantes' wealth. At this moment, the music for the third dance sounded. Hibbert Hall turned to Mary and said, "May I have the pleasure of a dance with you? That's what I've been waiting for." Mary immediately extended her hand. This made Klein unable to exchange name cards with them. However, he wasn't in a rush, because it was still some time before the ball ended. After getting another plate of food, he enjoyed it while looking at the dance floor, admiring the madams and ladies dancing. During this process, he noticed that Member of Parliament Mocked and Ma'am Rihanna were mingling with different guests from time to time, having happy conversations with them and even dancing with them. According to Walter, after confirming the guest list, the hosts need to seriously conclude every guest's preference and background, so as to tailor a different topic of conversation or jokes for them. This is to make everyone feel as though they are being treated uniquely. Socializing in high society sure is troublesome. Haha. This might be why Lowanese gentlemen tend to have receding hairlines. Klein lampooned as he sighed in reflection. He retracted his gaze and looked at his cleared plate. He seriously considered if he should invite another lady or madam to a dance, or if he should eat a little more. At this moment, he caught Hazel Mock's figure through the corner of his eye. She was heading for the third story with hurried footsteps. Chapter 761. Good people and good deeds, what happened? Klein instantly tensed up. He had experienced too many accidents in the past, and he knew that he easily found himself involved in beyonder matters. Upon encountering something similar, he couldn't help but subconsciously be on alert. It did resemble some form of post-traumatic stress disorder. After seriously watching Hazel Mock's figure disappear from the staircase, Klein sensed that she was only in a hurry and wasn't panicking. This means that she has the matter under control. Besides, Mock is a member of Parliament of the House of Commons, a member of high society just below the nobles in the kingdom. There should be beyonders around protecting him. Yes, Earl Hall's eldest son is here too, so his bodyguards must be beyonders as well. Besides, St. Samuel Cathedral is only a 10-minute carriage ride from Buckland Street. If anything were to really happen, the Nighthawks, priests, and bishops would rush over. Unless one has made up their mind to sacrifice themselves, no one would create an accident at this ball. Klein gradually calmed down and had another guess regarding Hazel's situation. She was rushing to the third story to resolve the negative effects of the mystical item. The question Klein had asked Rhodes previously was where he could obtain a mystical item which could steal the beyonder powers of others, and one of the answers he received was Hazel Mocked. Thinking back to their dance, Hazel's image rapidly reconstructed in Klein's mind with her different accessories as his focus. Hair ornaments, earrings, necklace, brooch, fishnet gloves. Which one could it be? Klein retracted his gaze and found himself thirsty. Hence, he picked up a cup of water and downed it. Just as he put down the cup, he saw his etiquette teacher, Warana Heisen, approach him with a plate. This lady was dressed in a red dress, but she didn't look tawdry. She smiled at Dwayne Dantes and said, "I noticed that you don't enjoy drinking alcohol. I've once missed an important matter as a result of drinking." Klein randomly fleshed up Dwayne Dantes's character as an experienced person with depth. Of course, he knew how to restrain himself. He didn't use his faceless powers to remove a finger to prove how determined he was when making that former oath. When Warana heard that, she smiled and thought, "Your past is filled with mystery. This is fatally attractive to many young ladies." She didn't continue on the topic as she said, "I forgot to tell you that the problem my husband faced has been resolved." Klein picked up a cup of champagne and raised it. He then said with a smile, "This is something to be happy about. Congratulations." He didn't mention anything about him helping in secret. Warana gave him a deep, penetrating look as she raised the cup of red wine in her hand. "Cheers." After clinking cups and taking a sip, Klein politely excused himself, put down his cup, and headed for the washroom. This wasn't because he wanted to head above the gray fog, but was solely due to the negative effects of Death Knell. He had drunk too much water and needed to relieve himself. When he walked out of the washroom, Klein looked up at the staircase that led from the second story to the third story. He found Hazel Mocked walking down with unhurried footsteps. She wore an unperturbed expression. Indeed, it wasn't a huge problem. It's likely a result of the negative side effects of the mystical item she possesses. "I wonder what it is." Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he casually swept the dance floor. During the interlude between two songs, he walked over to a lady and invited her to a dance. With Dwayne Dantes's appearance and bearing, his invitation was undoubtedly accepted. With him dancing, eating, chatting, and eating again, the ball slowly came to an end as the guests bade farewell one after another. Having completed his mission of exchanging name cards, Klein did the same. However, he wasn't the first or last person to leave. The hall soon turned silent as Ma'am Rihanna monitored the servants while they cleaned up the area. Meanwhile, she beckoned for her daughter, Hazel Mocked. "Mr. Dwayne Dantes's performance was better than I imagined. Many ladies had even asked me about him in private," Ma'am Rihanna said in a veiled manner. "Hazel, what's your impression of him when you were dancing and chatting with him? You're a lot more mature than girls your age. I believe in your taste and judgment." She knew her daughter very well, and she had deliberately added the last sentence. Otherwise, Hazel was unlikely to be interested in giving a detailed answer. Hazel wasn't that arrogant when facing her mother. She said after some thought, "He's not very familiar with this circle, and he easily mentions topics that can be offensive, but he's very knowledgeable." Very knowledgeable. Ma'am Rihanna was slightly surprised as she repeated her daughter's words. With her understanding of Hazel, this was a rather good compliment. She couldn't help but be worried that her daughter had taken a liking to Dwayne Dantes. Hazel thinks little of the eligible bachelors around her because they are too young, inexperienced, and incapable? Deities happens to be the kind of man that girls who mature early like. Rihanna suddenly felt a little regret inviting the gentleman to the ball. She knew that with Hazel's personality, she might very well elope if she were to suffer any objection to her newfound love. Hazel seemed to sense her mother's thoughts and said without emotion, "I only like men who are sufficiently powerful." Phew. Rihanna silently heaved a sigh of relief as she was no longer worried about the problem from before. This was because Hazel was a girl who found lying beneath her. Late at night, Hazel got up from bed. With her night vision, she changed into clothes that facilitated movement. She climbed down from her bedroom's balcony and carefully avoided her family's bodyguards. She went all the way to the garden and came to the middle of Buckland Street. Not every sewer manhole allowed a human passage with vertical metal ladders. Hazel adeptly moved the manhole cover away and climbed down before closing the cover from underneath. Nearly 45 minutes after, she moved the manhole cover again and returned into the shadows of the street. At this moment, Hazel saw a shadow nimbly flip into a garden nearby. Unit 160. She read the corresponding address. It was none other than Deities' residence. On the manor's third story, Klein was once again awoken from his sleep due to his spiritual intuition. He had the urge to capture the infiltrator that disturbed his sleep and feed it to creeping hunger. This time, he directly opened his iron cigar case and released his wraith marionette. Senor, in his dark red coat, first walked into the full-body mirror before leaping over to the oriel window in his valet's room. He observed Richardson and saw the valet sit up as he looked at the door with fear and anxiety. The door silently opened as a shadow flashed in. Under the crimson moonlight, the infiltrator exposed brownish-yellow skin, a soft outline, and short curly black hair. He obviously hailed from the southern continent. With a gloomy cold aura, he stood by the door and looked at Richardson, saying in a deep voice, "Have you decided? Do not believe that you can attain your calm life by leaving. Inside of you flows the blood of death's subjects. You are destined to give up everything to restore God's glory. Think about your deceased mother. Think about the insults you once suffered. Do you wish that your child will grow up under the contemptuous looks of others, to be a servant of others forever?" "But what can I do?" Richardson lowered his head as he said with great difficulty. "Wait for the mission." The infiltrator's voice turned gentler. Richardson didn't commit to an answer as he seemed to be struggling inwardly. As for the infiltrator, he didn't seem to care about his hesitation. He treated it as though Richardson had agreed, turned around, left the room and traced his steps back. Death subject. Someone from the numinous episcopate, or another organization that's trying to restore Balaam. Having witnessed everything, Klein leaned back into bed and silently said, "What mission would they give Richardson? Steal my money to provide funds for the organization? Or will they create a terrorist incident at one of the balls of high society?" At that moment, the infiltrator had climbed down from the balcony, passed through the garden, and flipped over the perimeter fence made of steel bars. Suddenly, he saw a figure pounce over from his left. He dodged as he clenched his fist and threw a punch. Thud! The punch hit the black figure, but it pierced straight through. It was as though he had struck a shadow created by the street lamp. Meanwhile, he suffered a heavy blow to the back of his head as he fainted onto the ground. Hazel's figure immediately surfaced behind the infiltrator as she wore an excited expression. It was as though she had completed a successful scam. She quickly reined in her emotions as she maintained her arrogant demeanor. She turned to look at the black metal gates of 160 Buckland Street. This girl bent her back and held the infiltrator by the arm as she dragged him to Deities' doorstep. Immediately after that, Hazel let go of her left hand, cleaned up any traces, walked forward with her chin slightly lifted, and pulled the doorbell. Then, she quickly departed, heading straight to her home through the shadows in the street. And on a street lamp outside Unit 160, on the black metal gate was a piece of glass. It reflected a figure wearing a dark red coat and an old triangular hat. It had seen the entire process. How should I deal with this? Inside the room, Klein was stumped. He knew that Hazel was doing a good anonymous deed for her neighbor to finish off an infiltrator, but this way, if his butler were to make a police report, the matter would be investigated in detail, causing the matter to be transferred to the Nighthawks. When the time came, whoever struck the infiltrator unconscious would become an important question. If Klein was really an ordinary person, it wouldn't have mattered. He could allow the Nighthawks to carry out their investigation. However, not only was he a powerful Sequence 5 Beyonder, but he was also scheming to steal an item from behind Cheney's gate. He didn't wish for any external setbacks to spoil his plans, or else he would have to change identities once again. To be frank, his earliest solution was to find a way to terminate Richardson's services. However, what he had heard changed his mind a little. If I were to terminate Richardson's services, it would be equivalent to pushing him into the abyss despite his desire for a quiet life. It will force him to mix with those people. Unfortunately, Dwayne Dantes has a mission. Otherwise, helping him in passing wouldn't be difficult. Klein sighed as he thought. 10 seconds later, the unconscious infiltrator suddenly stood up, cracked his neck, and hid in the nearby shadows. And at this moment, Butler Walter had walked out of the house's main door after hearing the doorbell. Chapter 762. Nation Reestablishment Society at the gates. Walter used the light from the street lamps and discovered no one was outside through the gaps. The street was silent. For an instant, Walter suspected if he had heard wrong and that the doorbell hadn't rung. He composed himself, and he quickly walked to the servant quarters at the back of the compound. He woke up a few servants and got them to carry double-barreled hunting rifles to begin patrolling the main building so as to prevent any bandits or burglars from infiltrating. Walter didn't immediately get the police, because nothing had happened yet. The doorbell from earlier might have been a prank from a tramp. Meanwhile, under the nearby sewers, the infiltrator was holding onto the metal handles as he slowly headed down into the unlit area. He soon came to a halt, leaned back onto the moss-covered wall, and slowly slid down to sit down on the dirty ground. His eyes closed again as though he was still in an unconscious state. In front of him, a middle-aged man wearing a dark red coat and an old triangular hat instantly appeared. He was none other than Klein's marionette, Wraith Senor. Senor bent down, rummaged through the infiltrator's pockets and found 7 soldi and 11 pence, as well as tiny cloth bags containing different kinds of powders. Inside the room, Klein remotely controlled his marionette from dozens of meters away. As he identified the powder, he discovered that his theories were correct. They were all herbal powder in the death domain, and a portion of them could be used for spirit channeling. He was very likely to be a beyonder from the corpse collector pathway that hailed from Balam. Even if he hadn't reached Sequence 7 spirit medium, it was very normal for him to prepare the corresponding herbal powders, essential oils, and extract. After all, these materials weren't only used for spirit channeling. Immediately, Klein controlled Senor to set up a ritual to pray to the Fool. Then, he went above the gray fog to respond, allowing Senor to complete what followed. After doing all of this, he returned to the real world and continued controlling Senor, allowing him to channel the spirit. Passing through a storm of glimmers, Klein saw the infiltrator's spirit. He appeared listless, blurry, and translucent. "What's your name? What faction do you belong to?" Senor asked with a deep voice. The infiltrator answered blankly, Godot pose. "I belong to the Black Skeleton Gang." Black Skeleton Gang. I believe it's a gang that's active around the border of East Borough and the dock area close to the Backland Bridge area. It's mainly filled with people of Balam heritage. Although they aren't as barbaric and boorish as the Zmanger gang, they aren't strangers to violence. As Klein recalled the intelligence he had previously gathered, he made Senor continue asking, "What do you mainly do? Why are you looking for Richardson?" Godot Pose answered in a muddled state, "We are fighting for God. We were originally members of the Balam Nation Reestablishment Society. We established the Black Skeleton Gang to grasp various intel and obtain funds. Apart from that, we also have another mission. It is to seek out any items related to death, and send it back to the southern continent. This time, we obtained verified information that in Earl Wolf's collection is a mask taken out from the Eggers family mausoleum. This family is a descendant of God. For this mask, we need to send someone to infiltrate Earl Wolf's household as a servant or infiltrate during one of the balls and banquets he hosts. And Richardson is an excellent choice. He has no history with any of the other organizations, and he's an experienced servant. The servants of nobles are often inherited. It's obviously not easy to infiltrate. Only short-term employments will be made if there's a sudden need for plenty of manpower. Speaking of which, there really is such a situation. At the ball today, a few ladies had mentioned that some nobles who are financially tight will sell lots of their lands and manors, and also dismiss nearly all their servants, leaving fewer than 10 to serve them, so as to barely maintain a decent lifestyle. When there are large-scale balls or banquets that require manpower, they would spend money to hire a bunch of temporary workers from the Family Servant Assistance Association to keep up a front. Also, Earl Wolf actually has a mask from the descendants of Death's family. I recall Mr. Azek's last name to be Eggers. Unfortunately, I don't wish to be disturbed by any accidents at the moment. Otherwise, I might have come up with a way to help Mr. Azek obtain that mask. Klein mumbled silently and made Senor continue asking. How do you know Richardson? Godotpose said blankly. We got to know each other at a manor in East Balam. Back then we were both slaves. Among the slaves, there are people who secretly spread the faith of death. Richardson, his mother, and I couldn't help but become believers of death in such a life. We secretly joined an organization that had a lot of influence among the slaves there. Later, Richardson's mother passed away from an illness, and he was brought to Backlund, while I stayed in East Balam before I found an opportunity to escape. A few years later, I was sent to Backlund, and I chanced upon Richardson. He actually forgot about his mother's death and the abuse he had once received. He forgot his faith towards God, and had his will eroded by what he called a peaceful life. To avoid me, he deliberately made mistakes and kept switching employers. But how could he have guessed that his former companion is no longer an ordinary human? Everyone has the right to choose as long as they don't harm others. However, Richardson and I are two different kinds of people. In the room, Klein closed his eyes and made Senor ask in a deep voice. What's the organization that is very influential among the slaves? Godotpose hesitated for a moment and said, The Eternal Life Society. Those who believe in death will obtain eternal life in the underworld once they leave the real world that's filled with pain and sorrow. Eternal Life Society. I'm aware of this. It's a branch of the Numinous Episcopate. As a former Nighthawk, Klein knew quite a lot about such matters. He continued controlling Senor to interrogate Godotpose, and he obtained plenty of information regarding the Eternal Life Society, East Balam Nation Reestablishment Society, and the Black Skull Gang, while confirming that Godotpose and his gang had their hands covered in the blood of the innocent. After finishing the spirit channeling and clearing up any traces, he waited 30 minutes before letting the wraith enter Godotpose's body, controlling him to climb out of the sewers and returning back into the shadows of the streets. And at this point, the servants in 160 Backlund Street, who were wielding double-barreled hunting rifles, were no longer as vigilant while doing their patrolling rounds. They seemed to believe that any latent danger had passed. Klein pretended as though he didn't notice anything as he continued sleeping in his master bedroom. However, he had already set up a ritual to summon and respond to himself. With Azek's copper whistle, the iron cigar case, and creeping hunger, he silently left his residence in the form of a spirit. He followed behind Godotpose and constantly maintained a distance of 80 meters. By using his marionette to possess this hostage, he made him circle to another street and board a rental carriage by the side of the road. About an hour later, Godotpose returned to the headquarters of the Black Skeleton Gang, a tiny house situated near the docks. There were plenty of firearms stashed away here, with several operatives that were sent from the East Balam Nation Reestablishment Society. They formed the upper ranks of the Black Skeleton Gang. Following the method that was agreed upon, Godotpose knocked on the door, and he said to a member who came towards him, Richardson has submitted. Very good. The member inattentively shot Godotpose a glance, made way for him, and gave him passage. Godotpose surveyed the area and found the high-yield explosives and a bunch of rifles stacked in the corner of the house. A few of the top brass of the Black Skeleton Gang were gathered together, discussing something. Godotpose, want a smoke? The member from before handed him a cigarette. This was a cigarette fashioned to the preferences of the southern continent. They were made from dried tobacco leaves mixed with tiny amounts of herbs. Godotpose received the cigarette and casually picked up a box of matchsticks from the table, took out a few sticks and lit them. Then, he threw the few burning matchsticks to the corner where the easily flammable explosives were. Everyone present looked at Godotpose with a dumbfounded look, momentarily at a loss as to what had happened. Rumble. On a public bench dozens of meters away, Klein sat there as the flames blazed behind him, a hot gust of air swarming out of the house. A few seconds later, Senor in his dark red coat appeared beside him, with some signs of being burned. The wraith held his hand to his chest and bowed before returning inside the gold coin inside the iron cigar case. Unfortunately, I won't be able to pick up the Beyonder characteristics. Otherwise, it wouldn't appear like an accident. It'll definitely be suspicious if the upper echelons of the Black Skeleton Gang don't have any Beyonders. Klein silently sighed as he cleared any traces before ending the summoning and returning above the gray fog. The next morning, he got up and washed up as though nothing had happened. He then waited for his valet to bring in a change of clothes. Richardson entered in silence as he finished his work skillfully. Following that, he took a step back and bowed his head. Sir, after serving you this week, I wish to resign. He typically received a weekly salary from housekeeper Tanaja. Why? Klein looked at himself in the mirror as he adjusted his vest. Meanwhile, he leisurely thought. Not bad at all. You know how to resign by your own volition and not bring trouble to your employer. Richardson had already thought of an excuse. I believe I'm lacking in ability to be a valet. At last night's ball, I realized how lacking I was when I was interacting with the servants of the other guests. Klein smiled. Everyone begins with zero experience. Few grew up with experience. Consider it again, and give me your final answer tomorrow. Yes, sir. Richardson didn't speak further as he took the initiative to leave the room. He went to the first floor to help his employer pick up the morning papers. During this process, he would always first flip through it and place the most interesting articles at the top. While flipping through, his gaze froze as he focused on an article. An explosion happened at 79 Durham Street in the Backland Bridge area. It's suspected to be related to the Black Skeleton Gang. According to the police, all the upper echelons of the Black Skeleton Gang died in this accident, including Lima, Morera, Godot. Richardson shook his head, suspecting that he was dreaming. Chapter 763. Mr. X 160 Buckland Street. Inside the dining hall on the second story. Klein had just bitten into the buttered toast his servant had served him when he saw his butler walk in. Walter bowed and said, Sir, a person of unknown origins pulled our doorbell last night. As it was already very late, I didn't wake you up, and instead got the servants to patrol the area with the double-barreled hunting rifles. If you so permit it, I'll visit the nearby police station to get them to reinforce the patrols on this street at night. To employ such a butler, there aren't any flaws aside from him being expensive. Klein nodded slightly and drank the fresh milk that had been delivered to him. Very good. 39 Buckland Street. Member of Parliament Mock's house. Hazel entered the activity room on the second floor and saw her mother, Rihanna, chatting with the housekeeper. What happened? She pushed a lock of black-green hair to the back of her ear. Rihanna chuckled and said, Someone rang Dantes' doorbell late last night. A prank? Hazel sat down. No one knows. Anyways, Dantes' butler specially went to the police station this morning. Rihanna recounted what she had learned from her servant. Hazel nodded slightly and said, It's best to have the police involved. But it's useless. No one knows who pulled the doorbell. Apparently, there wasn't anyone there. Rihanna laughed while shaking her head. Hazel was taken aback as she blurted out. There wasn't anyone there? That's right. Dantes' butler only seemed to ask the police to double their efforts on the night patrols on our street. That's good news. As the wife of a member of Parliament of the House of Commons, and the daughter of a famous lawyer, Rihanna had very good relations with the police. Not a single person, Hazel repeated softly before falling into silence. After a while, she left the activity room and returned to the third story. Along the way, she couldn't help but clench her fist and swing it as though she was testing something. In between her brows was a clear look of puzzlement. Inside his bedroom, Klein looked at the large pile of gold coins in front of him. All he saw was the shiny color of gold. There was a total of 4,000 pounds of gold coins. After a week of gathering funds, Admiral of Stars Katlia had finally completed the transaction for the Scales of Luck. Apart from the gold coins, she had also paid another 6,500 pounds in cash. To be honest, having a pile of gold coins is way more visually shocking than a pile of cash of the same size. As Klein sighed, he took out the 13 lone gold coins he received from Senor, from his pocket and threw it into the pile. After doing all of this, he took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Silently, Rionette Tinker appeared in front of him with the 4 blonde red-eyed heads in her hand. Ma'am, this is the first installment, a total of 4,013 pounds. Klein retracted his gaze from the pile of gold coins and looked at Miss Messenger. He was actually quite curious as to how Miss Messenger would move such a huge pile of gold coins. He remembered that she always used her teeth when collecting letters. Very good, you still have 5,987. Rionette Tinker's head said one after another. There's no need to remind me. Klein forced a smile and said, I'll try to gather the rest as soon as possible. Rionette Tinker didn't speak further as one of the heads tried hard to open its mouth. Suddenly, The area before her turned dark and deep. All the gold coins were sucked up by vortex-like surging water. In a few short seconds, the large pile of gold coins vanished. Rionette Tinker's 4 heads nodded at the same time before returning to the spirit world. I still have 8,156 pounds and 5 lone gold coins. I can barely be considered a tycoon. I could actually afford any investment opportunities if they appear, and it won't just be me raising the price and mentioning it in passing. This way, I won't be suspected to be a cheat for the time being. Heh. Be a little optimistic. Perhaps the investment opportunity might allow me to earn back the money I spent. It's always fast to make money work for you. Klein silently exhaled as he cast his gaze out the window, forcing himself to enjoy the thinly fogged streets. At night time in the East Borough, the surrounding area was pitch black due to the few street lamps available, along with many of them being damaged. It was as though there were countless monsters and criminals lurking within. Xiao Dericha wore a hooded cloak, turned into a small alley, and came outside to what seemed like a dilapidated house. This was the new gathering in East Borough she had previously mentioned to Furs. Xiao wasn't in a rush to knock on the door with the agreed-upon signal. She first looked down to check her attire. Unlike how she usually dressed, she wore a pair of long boots. They didn't look odd, but Xiao knew very well that the soles were very thick. She had stuffed plenty of things inside, allowing a person to magically appear taller. And this effectively hid Xiao's greatest characteristic. Feeling assured by the presence of her triangular blade, Xiao pulled her hood up and knocked on the door with the signal. Soon, she was led into an activity room inside as she randomly found a spot to sit down. After the participants had mostly arrived, the host of the gathering finally walked in. He was of medium build, with a height of about 1.75 m. He wore a black classical robe, a pointed mage hat, with a brass mask on his face. He gave off an ancient and mysterious vibe. Rather dark skin, but it's not exactly brown. He resembles someone from Fainapotter or Desi Bay. But I can't be sure. It might be a tan. He has raven black curly hair. This does match my first guess. Xiao sized him up as a sheriff. The man in the brass mask looked around the room before laughing deeply. You can call me Mr. X. Mr. X. Xiao couldn't help but twitch the corners of her mouth. After becoming an outer circle member of MI9, she had learned quite a bit of the situations regarding the secret organizations, and that included the Aurora Order. Therefore, she knew very well that the oracles of the Aurora Order used alphabets as their code names, and they enjoyed addressing themselves as Mr. or Ma'am. And from her point of view, to address themselves in front of others in such a manner was obvious exposure of their identity and background. After all, the members who participated in these gatherings were mostly Beyonders who were lacking in knowledge. Isn't he afraid that others would report him? It's no wonder the gentleman from MI9 said that the Aurora Order is filled with lunatics, that there's no way to understand their actions with the logic of the average person. Ever since Mr. A vanished, there have been a few gatherings in Backlund that had impersonators, or gatherings that were hosted by his associates for their own benefit. The hosts were quickly reported and ended up being arrested. It's not necessarily the case that Mr. X is from the Aurora Order. Perhaps, he's just like the others. Xiao retracted her observing gaze and silently watched the gathering continue. She seldom reported matters, because she had experience as an unaffiliated Beyonder. She knew it wasn't easy to survive in this world with such identities. So long as there wasn't any accidents, she wouldn't provide such intel to MI9. If it's confirmed that he's an oracle of the Aurora Order, I'll report him. These people are all lunatics. They will bring about extreme danger. As Xiao thought over the matter, she watched the others exchange information and complete trades. She didn't participate much in it, firstly because there wasn't any information or item of interest, and secondly, she was saving up for her interrogator potion. After the end of the gathering, she returned to her residence at Sherwood Borough. Xiao saw Furs wearing a face mask that was said to be able to moisturize faces as she lay there leisurely reading. How was it? How was that gathering? Furs asked, pretending as though she wasn't interested. Xiao threw her cloak to the side and said, there were quite a number of participants, and there were quite a number of items as well, but they were mostly for low-sequence Beyonders. No one will offer anything good at the first gathering, Furs said as she lowered the novel in her hands. Yeah. Xiao nodded and said, the organizer of the gathering calls himself Mr. X, but no one knows if he's related to Mr. A. Mr. X. A suspected Aurora Order oracle. Could he be Louis Veen? Firz's attention was caught as she languidly leaned back and asked, "What does he look like?" "He wore a mask." Zio rolled her eyes at her. "Do you think I have the ability to see through an obstacle?" No. I mean his build." Furze had seen Louis Vine's full figure thanks to her teacher, Dorian Gray, and knew his characteristics. As a sheriff, Zio easily restored Mr. X's appearance and asked out of puzzlement. "Regardless if he's related to Mr. A or not, isn't he worried that he'll be reported for having such a name?" After Furze heard Zio's description and saw the portrait she made with her sheriff powers, she was delighted. There was a high chance that Mr. X was the traitor of the Abraham family, Louis Vine. He's not afraid of being reported because he's a traveler. He can calmly escape no matter what happens. If the official organizations were to use their experience like how they dealt with Mr. A, there's really no way they can restrain him. Furze silently mumbled. She stopped talking about the topic and switched to something else. After Zio went to take a bath, she hurriedly used her powers as an astrologer to ask her spirituality, and she stacked Louis Vine's image with Mr. X's image before obtaining the answer that they were one and the same. "It's really him." Furze stood up as she paced about in excitement and glee in the living room. Her first thought was to report this to the various major churches, and also include the tip-off that the target had the powers of a traveler. Following that, she recalled her prior attempt at hiring Mr. World to assassinate Louis Vine. "Regardless, I should first ask Mr. World if he's free to take on this mission. I can't offend him." Upon recalling everything that Mr. World had done, Furze couldn't help but shiver. After making up her mind, she first checked that Zio was having a bath and wouldn't come out anytime soon before praying to Mr. Fool. "Please tell Mr. World that the Aurora Order's Oracle Louis Vine has appeared, and there's a high probability that he's a traveler, codenamed Mr. X." Chapter 764. First investigation. Klein was returning from St. Samuel Cathedral to Buckland Street on a four-wheeled carriage when he heard the stacked illusory pleas. "A female. It's nothing urgent." All he did was make a rough judgment and didn't immediately head above the gray fog to respond. Sweeping his glance at the street lamps which were dispelling the darkness, Klein retracted his gaze and raised the white porcelain with gold rims to take a sip. Beside him, Richardson noticed this and said after mustering his courage, "Sir, I've thought it through. You're very right. Everyone starts with zero experience. Few grow up with experience. Thank you for giving me this chance to grow." After confirming that Godotpose and gang were dead, he was finally at ease as he began considering his professional career. Switching employers repeatedly in a short period of time was a stain on a servant's record. Once he resigned from Dwayne Dantes's employ, Richardson believed that it would be difficult for him to continue being a valet. This would be extremely damaging for him. This was not only because a valet's annual salary was at least £25, and was way better than any non-management jobs. It was comparable to a lady's maid, and being a valet gave one the greatest opportunity of becoming a butler. By following their male or female employers and helping them in all kinds of trivialities, being their mouthpiece and assistant would allow them to build up their skills. It would allow them to grasp all the traits needed for being a butler and, as a result, become their employer's confidant. As long as there was a chance, one could easily be made a land steward, butler assistant or deputy butler, as they were slowly promoted to a butler. Richardson did yearn for a peaceful life, but this didn't mean that he was willing to be a servant his entire life. Without a doubt, he wished to rely on his hard work to earn more and gain a higher standing. And becoming the butler of a wealthy family was his ultimate goal. "It's not too late to realize that now," Klein replied with a smile, consenting to Richardson's retention. After returning to 160 Buckland Street, he instructed housekeeper Tanaja to prepare supper for him at 11:30 as he headed to the third story where he took off his coat and entered the bathroom. At that moment, the bathtub had already been heated to an appropriate temperature by a maid 5 minutes ahead of time. Klein wasn't in a rush to take his bath, as he went above the gray fog to determine who had prayed to him. "Mr. X. Traveler. Miss Magician is rather efficient. Without realizing it, she has matured quite well," Klein muttered to himself. After some serious consideration, he conjured the World Gairman Sparrow and made this fake person pray amidst the veil of the gray fog. "Give me the time, location, and provide more information. Only then will I take action." Klein's idea was very simple. He found a traveler's powers rather useful, but it was difficult for Dwayne Dantes to have a period of prolonged absence from Buckland Street, or stay in his room all the time. It would be fine if Miss Magician could provide detailed and reliable intel, allowing him to carry out the assassination once. But if she were to get the world to slowly gather information bit by bit, there was no way he could do it, as it affected his own plans. Soon, Furs gave a reply. I'll try to gather it as quickly as possible. As the location and timing for Mr. X's next gathering hadn't been confirmed, all she could do was patiently wait. After settling this matter, Klein returned to the real world, took off his clothes, and placed himself into the bathtub. The warm water enveloped him as he closed his eyes in comfort. He felt that the fatigue that plagued his body and mind were being washed away bit by bit. During this period of time, he had been to St. Samuel Cathedral a few times to listen to Bishop Electra's explanation of the revelation of Evernight. He had grasped the looks and characteristics of another two keepers, but he hadn't seen any repeated sightings, preventing him from determining the schedule of the keepers. And doing such acts would similarly bring him trouble. Klein opened his eyes as he looked at the steam above him, sighing inwardly. The first investigation should be coming soon. A person who often entered St. Samuel Cathedral's interior would likely be investigated by the Nighthawks, and with his origins still an unknown, such an investigation was almost necessary. If there aren't any investigations, it would be a serious case of negligence for the Nighthawks. Klein slowly exhaled. In the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral, Leonard slowly walked out of a quiet room. His green eyes had a tint of strange black water as countless illusory bubbles and ripples appeared and disappeared. Not bad. You're already a soul assurer and are almost catching up to me. Standing in the corridor was Daily Simone as she congratulated him in a self-deprecating manner. She was still wearing her hooded black robe, with blue eyeshadow and blush. She had quite an uncanny sense of beauty. When Leonard looked at this familiar lady, he found her bearing even colder than before. There seemed to be countless shadows hidden around her, in layers that went deep and felt cold. Clearly, I'm still very far from you. With your condition, you should be able to advance to gatekeeper, right? Leonard didn't act too casual in front of Daly, speaking rather formally. This was because if he attempted to make any jokes, the one who would eventually be left blushing in embarrassment would definitely be him instead of the lady. Gatekeeper was sequence 5 of the death pathway. I was ready 2 months ago, Daly said without concealing anything, her expression slightly warped. Leonard roughly understood what she meant as he nodded slightly. You haven't contributed enough. Daly curled her lips immediately. That's right. It's like I'm already in bed with everything in place, only to realize that there aren't any condoms at home. Worst of all, it's late at night, and most of the stores around the neighborhood have closed for the day. What an amazing analogy. Leonard didn't think it was right of him to respond as he said with a smile. You can choose to handle certain cases. Without giving Daly a chance to speak, he pointed at the other end of the corridor. Captain Soest is still waiting for me to report on my advancement. Daly didn't say a word as she watched him leave. By the time his back disappeared around the corner, this lady's expression seemed to turn to drift as she muttered softly, Captain Soest. In the room where Leonard's Red Gloves team was temporarily stationed in, Soest, who had just become a spirit warlock, saw his desultory subordinate walk in as he casually threw a dossier over. Very good. You've already advanced. I'll congratulate you later. First, investigate this target's dream. It was already late at night, but for the Nighthawks who were mainly staffed with sleepless, it was no different from day. They even felt stronger at night. Isn't this something the local Nighthawks do? Leonard received the dossier and asked in passing. They've recently been swamped with cases and are lacking in manpower. They've requested our help, Soest explained without much care. Leonard didn't ask further as he looked down and flipped through the dossier. The first thing that he caught sight of was a photograph, and the middle-aged gentleman on it had given him a deep impression. Dwayne Dantes. Leonard's pupils instantly constricted. He knew this man, aware that this person was an undying monster who had survived since the 4th epoch. He was at least a saint or even stronger. Furthermore, he knows my secret and old man's identity. Leonard instinctively raised his hand to rub his temples. Captain Soest, I just advanced, and my spirituality is a little out of control. Is that so? Only then did Soest realize that he might have made a mistake. He hurriedly turned to look at another red glove and said, Albert, you do it. Albert was a man in his 30s. His hair was slightly blonde, and his skin was pale. He didn't look too healthy. Leonard heaved a sigh of relief as he handed the dossier over to him. At this moment, his heart suddenly skipped a beat. Would Albert suffer any negative effects if he were to enter the undying monster's dream? At that moment, he felt a little regretful. He believed that he should have done it himself. At the very least, he knew the level of danger and had faced him before. It wouldn't result in him provoking him. Deities likely won't do anything to Albert. If he has any excessive reaction and causes anything abnormal to happen to Albert, he would immediately expose his problems to us. And with our church's strength and Backlund's situation, there's no way he can leave this city alive. Leonard quickly calmed down, believing that Deities would use a milder manner to avoid the dream investigation. He pulled over a chair and sat beside Albert. Although he appeared like he was reading the papers without much thought, he was constantly watching him to prevent any accidents from happening. 160 Backlund Street. Inside the master bedroom. Klein suddenly woke up in his dream, aware that someone had come. The investigation of the Nighthawks? As he mumbled, he surveyed the area and found himself in the half-open room. Following that, he heard knocks on the door. "Come on in." Klein tried hard to make his voice sound like a dreamy murmur. The doorknob twisted as the door opened. A thinly built blond man dressed in a black trench coat walked in. He was none other than the Red Glove, Albert. "I'm a superintendent from the Backlund Police Department." Albert casually showed proof of his identity and sat opposite Klein. "How may I help you, officer?" Klein got into character. He knew that due to the influence of a nightmare, he needed to appear normal. Albert conjured a stack of papers and began reading them softly. Deities. Mail. Hails from Desi County. He repeated all the intelligence that had been gathered and asked, "Is this set of information legitimate?" "Partially, but some of them are fake," Klein replied honestly. "The only partial truths are probably male and single." Meanwhile, he was making self-deprecating comments. Albert was pleased that he had made progress so quickly as he asked with a deadpan expression, "Which of these are fake?" Klein was already prepared for that as he pretended to recall. "Most of my wealth doesn't come from mining, but from adventuring in the southern continent." He fabricated a story from Anderson's description of West Balam about how a commoner earned his wealth by relying on his eloquence, intel, experience, and guts in an area that conflict often happened between Lone and Intis. This story wasn't considered very detailed, and it was mainly an outline. The main goal was to make the Nighthawks believe that Deities wasn't a beyonder, but just an ordinary person with a sense of adventure and risk. Such stories of people getting rich were common in Lone. Chapter 765. Monday again. After Klein was done, Albert asked a few targeted questions according to his recount, to ensure that the details matched up. Without a doubt, he obtained a satisfactory answer. "Thank you for your cooperation. Have a great dream." Albert smiled as he got up and bowed. Then, he used his nightmare powers to influence Deities once again. It would make him have a vague recollection that he had such a dream when he woke up, but he wouldn't be able to recall the specifics. After doing all of this, he turned to head for the door, turned the doorknob, and left the dream. Indeed, the Nighthawks placed too much trust in nightmare powers. If I were to be the one leading this investigation, I would definitely design a series of questions that attack the matter from different angles ahead of time, and then do cross-referencing to find any loopholes. The best method is to enlist Miss Justice's help in creating a set of professional psychological questionnaires and get the target to finish it in the dream. If he were faking something, the psychological state and the image he wishes to project would definitely show contradictions from different evaluations. This is unless he's also a psychological expert and can spot the true goals of each set of questions. Klein leaned back into the sofa and cast his gaze out the window. In the darkness, the street lamp's glow appeared dim and pale, illuminating the surroundings in a gloomy silence. Klein silently observed for a few seconds before he curled his lips and gave a self-deprecating smile. And in the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral, Leonard first heaved a sigh of relief after he saw Albert wake up normally and heard his report. He felt even more fearful of the undying monster from the fourth epoch. City of Silver. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating every street. Derek Berg walked out of his house with the axe of Hurricane in his possession, as he headed for the Twin Towers that was north of the city. Along the way, he met several residents of the City of Silver. They were either busy, sending their children for general education lessons, or patrolling every corner in groups. It was to prevent anyone from turning into an evil spirit after dying from an accident at home and being without a relative to end their lives. The existence of these people made the City of Silver appear lively, and from time to time, Derek could hear the laughter and cheers from little children. He couldn't help but recall the days in Afternoon Town. The number of humans he met every day had numbered about 20, and most of the time, they needed to stay in a garrisoned building. Outside were monsters that lurked in houses under the cloak of darkness. They were eradicated again and again, but they would appear time and time again from unknown places. Every team member from the expedition felt a sense of helplessness towards this, as though there was no way of gaining true safety. They could never feel at ease with the need to go all out at any time. There was no chance for them to relax at all. No ordinary creature would wish to maintain such states of high stress and vigilance for prolonged periods of time. Therefore, in regards to that, the City of Silver had already developed a rotation system. It didn't take much time for the first expedition team to go from Afternoon Town back to the City of Silver, but there was the unavoidable quarantine and relaxation period. It was only today that Derek had managed to adjust himself to a mental state which he believed he could withstand the negative effects from advancing. He had previously reported to Chief Colin Iliad that he had obtained the potion formula to notary, and he was allowed to use this discovery to exchange for the corresponding beyonder ingredients, feathers of a spirit-packed bird. As for the items he owed the moon, he had obtained them from patrolling Afternoon Town's surroundings and had passed them to him with Mr. Fool's help. After advancing, I'll be qualified to select a mystical item for non-high sequence beyonders. Derek felt a little expectant as he sped up his pace, and arrived at the Twin Towers. Although the material warehouse and the mystical items were all in the spire where they were watched by the 6-member council, Derek's goal was the steeple, because that was where he could exchange his contribution points for items. Just as he was about to enter the steeple, he felt his spiritual perception trigger. He subconsciously looked up at the spire, and he saw a woman in a black purple-patterned robe standing behind a window, looking down at him. She had silver-grayish hair, light gray eyes, and a beautiful face. She was none other than one elders of the 6-member council, Shepherd Lovia. When their eyes met, Lovia's gaze seemed to penetrate his soul, but her expression remained the same. She even nodded slightly as though she was greeting him. She's not greeting me, but the person behind me. Suddenly, Derek came to a realization. This was from the experience he slowly accumulated under the guidance of the Tarot Club. He nodded in response as he retracted his gaze without any signs of abnormality. He then unhurriedly entered the steeple. At night, in a private harbor in Byam, the Golden Dream, with its strange main cannon in the middle, docked by the side of the harbor. Danitz carried the local specialties that the Resistance had given him as he waved at them with a beaming smile while he headed up the gangway to the deck. He had been leading an extremely comfortable life in recent times. As an envoy who sent arms, food, and small amounts of beyonder ingredients, he received quite good treatment. He either ate sumptuously or enjoyed himself by hunting and bragging. He was even invited to watch the ritual in which the sea god blessed his believers. After witnessing all of this, he suddenly came to a realization. Byam, or perhaps all the colonies, would eventually embroil themselves in an intense conflict. It was something that wouldn't ease with decades or even a century. Therefore, Danitz decided to sell most of his properties in Byam, leaving behind only one piece of property. He then found a chance to buy properties in the Intis capital, Trier, and the Lone capital, Backlund, as well as extremely idyllic and peaceful villages. I can also take the opportunity to return to Elema town and visit the old man and mom. Yes, I can buy one less house and get them a vineyard. Danitz waved passionately at the Resistance once again. He then puffed up his chest and said smugly to Flowery Bowtie Jodson, "Where's Captain? I need to report to her on the recent developments." Jodson sked in contempt. "She's obviously in the captain's cabin." Meanwhile, he lampooned inwardly. This fellow is becoming more and more arrogant after establishing ties with Gairman Sparrow. However, that crazy adventurer is really terrifying. He actually managed to hunt Admiral of Blood. Heh! Danitz scoffed as he walked with a provocative gait and entered the cabin where he met Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards. He instantly stopped his provocative look as he smiled. "Captain, I've completed the mission." "Details?" Edwina put down the book in her hand as she asked. Danitz was already prepared as he gave a detailed description of what had happened recently while exaggerating his importance. When he was done, he said, "Captain, I met Gairman Sparrow, and he got me to ask you if there have been any abnormalities with elvish songster Ciotas's corpse and that golden wine cup." Edwina didn't answer him directly as she walked to a corner in the captain's cabin. Sitting there was a black wooden chest. The Golden Dream was setting sail for Sonia Island, so Ciotis's and Mobit's remained on the ship. They were stored by Edwina in a specially prepared chest. Bending one knee in genuflection, Edwina opened the wooden chest, allowing the interlocked remains to see the light of day. The mostly squashed golden wine cup was held silently in a bony palm without any abnormal signs. "There's nothing abnormal," Edwina gave the conclusion. Danitz shot a glance and memorized the answer, preparing to report this to the mighty fool once there wasn't anyone around, so that he could forward the message to the lunatic, Gehrman Sparrow. Nothing abnormal? Above the gray fog, Klein frowned slightly, feeling a mixture of puzzlement and ease. According to his theory, there was a high chance that there was a problem with the golden cup. To have nothing abnormal happen to it had exceeded his expectations. However, he also liked the answer. This was because he didn't wish for Ciotis's and Mobit's eternal slumber to be disturbed. Perhaps it needs other additional catalysts? Heh, let's hope that never happens. Klein muttered to himself before casting his gaze onto the junk pile where Grozel's travels was. As he temporarily didn't have any intention of entering the sea of collective subconscious, along with his recent focus being on the Antigonus family's notebook, he had delayed his plans of searching the book world a second time. Phew. Klein exhaled, retracted his gaze and prepared for this week's tarot gathering. 3 in the afternoon, Backlund time. Dark red beams of light shot up along the two sides of the long mottled table, materializing into different blurry figures. As usual, Audrey was in a good mood, or perhaps in a better mood than usual. This was because her brother, Hibbert Hall, had sent a telegram, informing her that the purchase of the Backlund Bike Company's 10% shares was completed for a total of £12,000. Furthermore, she didn't need to rush back to Backlund to sign any documents. Before Hibbert set off, she had signed a letter of authorization while under the witness of 2 lawyers. All she needed to do now was wait for everything to be over before signing a letter of confirmation for her brother. Audrey curled up the corners of her lips as she stood up and said to the figure sitting at the end of the bronze table who was concealed by grey fog, "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. May Mr. Fool bless me. I hope there will be clues to the fruit of an illusory chime tree today." Immediately after that, she began praying in silence. After exchanging greetings and taking their seats, Katlia didn't let down Klein's expectations. Once again, she lowered her head without daring to look straight at him. "Mr. Fool, there are 3 pages of Emperor Rozel's diary this time. Has that Queen Mystic still not found the clues to why Emperor Rozel was assassinated? She's still providing diary pages through Ma'am Hermit. What a pity, I've recently been in the fief, and I haven't had much contact with the psychology alchemists. I can't even obtain new diary pages. I'll head over to the Relic Search and Preservation Foundation after a few days to take a look. Perhaps they might have found something." Audrey listened in curiosity. The fool Klein chuckled. "Very good. You can consider your request. In fact, I know that Queen Mystic has already given you the question. I wonder what she's doing in Backlund." Klein's mind started to wander. Soon, Katlia conjured the 3 diary pages and handed it to Mr. Fool. Chapter 766. The Deities anchor. Knowing that the diary pages specially selected by Queen Mystic contained rather important information, the fool Klein focused his attention and cast his eyes on the yellowish-brown goatskin in his hand. September 11th. Ever since I became an angel, I've had the feeling that I've had my identity disassociated. In my heart, in my soul, and in the depths of my mind, there's ultimately a voice urging me, influencing me and creating an uncontrollable sense of coldness, bloodthirstiness, cruelty and craziness. This doesn't stem from the external world or an influence from a god of the same pathway. I can clearly sense that it comes from one's genes, the collective subconsciousness of humanity from generation after generation. It stems from the beyonder characteristic itself, and not from the remnant psychological influences. It makes me have a strong desire to hunt and kill. It makes me want to devour all the living beings around me with beyonder characteristics. It requires me to spend a lot of effort to resist it. Even if I've already acted and digested the potion, it doesn't seem to improve. It's no wonder that Mr. Dorr said that rationality is temporary, but madness is eternal. September 28th. I haven't written a diary entry in ages. In the past half a month, I seem to see myself being replaced by a stranger. Bit by bit, I turn cold and terrifying. Even my daughter Bernadette can only allow me to show her minute amounts of fatherly love. Very, very tiny amounts. Just as I was about to go mad, I seemed to hear countless praises. They were from my subjects, people who had benefited from my reformations. They are the believers who view me as the son of steam. They praise me with great acclaim. They erected statues of me, write stories for me, and have created songs and poems for me. Their voices seem like a ship's anchor that helps me secure myself in place. I began to have the ability to resist that desire and that roar within me. Bit by bit, I walked out of it as I once again possessed the normal feelings of a father, a husband, and a man. Just sequence 2 alone causes such changes. At sequence 0, at the level of a true God, how terrifying would it be to resist that madness? Perhaps they also need an anchor so as to resist the beyonder characteristics and the strong inclination to lose control, the urges buried deep in the collective subconscious. I probably understand why they establish churches and why they want to spread their faith, to write stories for their faction saints and leave legends for their corresponding angels. But why do they not have any anthropomorphic form other than symbols? I can't understand it. I'll try asking Mr. Dorr in the future. He seems to know a lot in regards to the domain of deities. If he had been released back then, there might very well be an additional deity today. September 29th. After rereading yesterday's diary entry, I recalled the corresponding rituals of my sequence 4, sequence 3, and sequence 2. They clearly had hints of madness and cruelty, akin to the kinds held by antagonists in novels. A sequence pathway might very well be a path destined to be crazy and filled with despair. And this is the only path for humans to obtain extraordinary strength. How laughable and ironic it is. We strive to save ourselves, only to better destroy ourselves? The first page's content left Klein's heart heavy and repressed. The Roselle who had written those words was no longer an ordinary person, but someone who had become an angel, someone who had joined the Twilight Hermit Order, and someone who had seen the blasphemy slate. His understanding of the mysterious world and beyonder characteristics far exceeded him, but he was even more pessimistic than him. He seemed to believe that the world's origins were innately warped, crazy, and destined for destruction. However, the 7 deities have apparently found a way to maintain their rationality. Ordinary humans aren't without any use. Their cognition and their spirituality put together can help a deity anchor their original image, retaining their memories and reason that they had accumulated for years. This can be inferred from Roselle's own experiences. However, why would the 7 deities abandon their anthropomorphic images and use sacred emblems as a form of abstraction? This doesn't match my theories. I can't understand why. Klein didn't waste any time as he flipped to the next diary page. December 5th. Night of the Blood Moon. I conversed with Mr. Dorr. Like every time prior to this, he would always make a request to get me to help him return to the real world, but he doesn't overly insist on it. Furthermore, he would randomly answer some of my questions. Haha, it's like he is playing a game, trying hard to raise my affection towards him. But unfortunately, I'm sorry, I've already sealed off that option ahead of time. As I already knew of the legends of the Kings of Angels, I mainly asked Mr. Dorr about the level of strength that the Kings of Angels have, knowing the fact that I had nothing to lose by asking him that question. Mr. Dorr said that some of the Kings of Angels accommodated the uniqueness, while others had consumed 2 sets of sequence 1 potions. It could also be both. The word accommodate is used in an odd manner. I had asked him about it, but Mr. Dorr didn't directly answer me. All he said was that if one was unable to accommodate the uniqueness, then the uniqueness was a burden instead of an aid to a sequence 1 angel before they held the ritual to advance to sequence 0. It's understandable. It's akin to using a grade 0 sealed artifact. The negative effects are often terrifying, and the uniqueness must definitely be even more exaggerated. I also asked which Kings of Angels had accommodated their uniquenesses, and similarly, Mr. Dorr didn't give a direct answer. He only said that Amon and Adam make all the angels feel a sense of envy, because they were born with a uniqueness and didn't need to consider the problem of accommodation. From another point of view, does it mean that Amon and Adam's state is equivalent to having consumed a sequence 1 potion and the uniqueness? As expected of the Creator's sons. That Creator who's also known as the ancient sun god was actually so powerful that he could pass on a uniqueness to each of his 2 sons, as well as sequence 1 Beyonder's characteristics. Was he trying to purify himself to eliminate any unneeded interference? Then, does Mr. Dorr also accommodate a uniqueness, and also possibly have even consumed 2 sequence 1 potions? I didn't ask, because I knew he definitely wouldn't answer me. During the conversation, Mr. Dorr warned me not to directly say out Adam's full name. Otherwise, it would be detected and the conversation would be discovered. I had an inkling why as I laughingly asked him that didn't he just say Adam's full name? Mr. Dorr said it didn't matter. This is because the Apprentice Pathways Sequence 4 is called Secret Sorcerer. It has the meaning of maintaining secrecy, and although it's inferior to the Servant of Concealment, it's enough for him to block any detection at his level. I asked another few questions regarding the deities, but Mr. Dorr didn't answer. All he said was that when I had the ability and opportunity, I could head above the moon to take a look. I would then understand many things. This is somewhat in line with some of my previous thoughts, but I'm suspecting if he is luring me there to get a chance to return to the real world. After all, his appearance each time is related to the moon. As long as Mr. Dorr appears, there will be plenty of information, usually covering an entire page. His explanation of the level of strength that Kings of Angels have does match my theories. The generalized meaning of King of Angels implicitly refers to a quasi-deity who exceeds Sequence 1 by using a variety of means, but they have yet to reach the level of a Sequence 0. This includes accommodating the uniqueness or consuming additional Sequence 1 potions. The simplified meaning of King of Angels will point out to the Creator who the City of Silver worships, the 8 kings of all the angels that are ruled by the ancient sun god. Of course, they must also fulfill the general definition. Thoughts rapidly flashed through Klein's mind. As for Roselle's theory about the ancient sun god, he was in strong agreement. He believed that the Creator who the City of Silver worshipped had reclaimed too many authorities of the ancient gods, causing him to show signs of chaos and insanity. Hence, he decisively gave birth to 2 sons to eliminate a portion of the waste. To put it simply, Amon and Adam are freebies that come with drinking potions. From the looks of it, Angel of Imagination, Adam, clearly possesses the uniqueness of the spectator pathway. He is likely the mysterious leader of the Twilight Hermit Order. Since ancient times, he has been interfering with the direction of the times in order to revive his father. I wonder if he has advanced to Sequence 0. Even if he hasn't, the number of angels the Twilight Hermit Order can mobilize probably exceeds my imagination. Oh, Secret Sorcerer actually has the meaning of keeping secrets, as well as the implications of concealment. Klein instantly recalled the symbol on the back of the Fool's Chair. It was the pupil-less eye, a symbol representing secrecy, and the contorted lines that represented change. He quickly reined in his thoughts and flipped to the 3rd diary page. November 28th. I dreamed of Grimm again. He was the smartest among my subordinates, but unfortunately, he died in the fog sea due to some unknown infection while exploring that nameless island. He didn't even leave a child behind. Back then, I knew that the nameless island hid secrets with unimaginable danger, but due to my lacking strength, all I could do was hold back. The dream this time is likely a result of my spirituality reminding me that I can explore that island, grasp its secrets, and completely resolve Grimm's matter. November 29th. I summoned 3 subordinates, and with Benjamin Abraham's help and some searching, I finally found that nameless island again. I didn't directly enter, and I decided to rest for a day along its periphery. Edward said that he also often dreams of Grimm, feeling a deep sense of guilt for not having managed to save him back then. This is not your responsibility, but my problem. That was what I said to Edwards because I'm their leader. November 30th. We ventured deep into the island. Existing here were beyonder creatures that large sources of data claim that they have gone extinct. They gathered there without any conflict, as though they were consecrating something. This bunch of beyonder creatures without any intelligence appeared to be holding some ritual. They were praying to an unknown deity? In the ritual I saw Grimm. Chapter 767. Passing a message. Grimm, who got infected on the Nameless Island and was undeniably deceased, appeared once again on the Nameless Island? Emperor, when did you start writing horror stories? Also, where's the rest? Klein's gaze froze onto the last line of the 3rd diary page, and he discovered that there wasn't any new information. Apart from that, he was similarly alarmed by Emperor Roselle's description of the Beyonder creature's strange gathering and their worship of an unknown entity. One had to understand that not all Beyonder creatures had intelligence and could be communicated with. Many of them were monsters who had lost control or had madness as an innate property. And these monsters that had lost control were gathered together, worshipping some unknown existence. Unfortunately, the Emperor didn't leave behind the coordinates of the Nameless Island. However, even if he had recorded it, I wouldn't dare to head over, for fear of any infection. If I were to die only to be revived on the island, that would be troublesome. I'll need to be at least a sequence 4 or even a sequence 3 before I'll have what it takes to explore it. As Klein thought. He made the diary in his hand vanish. He then turned to look at Katlia and asked with a smile, "What's your request?" Katlia asked without even thinking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I wish to know if Emperor Roselle once participated in a very secretive and very ancient organization." Very secretive and very ancient. Twilight Hermit Order? Emperor Roselle used to be a member of it? Audrey suddenly recalled Mr. Fool's previous mention of that organization. Alger recalled the corresponding matter and remembered that in Miss Justice's description of the Desire Apostle case in Backlund, there was a mysterious organization mentioned. Back then, Mr. Fool had told the members not to say the organization's name in the outside world, because any mention of it will be known. Such an organization does match Emperor Roselle's status. Alger nodded inwardly. As for Klein, he thought of something else. Queen Mystic's choice of diary pages are vague. She isn't able to accurately and precisely ask questions based on the content. It also means that she roughly knows that diary pages from certain periods are very important with key information within them. Or she is able to discern Roselle's emotions from when it was written. As for Ma'am Hermit's question, it didn't pose any problems for Klein. He smiled and said yes. At the same time, he silently warned himself, in the future, I need to be careful that Queen Mystic's questions might be completely unrelated to the diary pages she hands over. Thankfully, I've read quite a number of Roselle's diary, and I have quite a good understanding of the Emperor. After saying that, he added and said with a smile, "It's your turn." He didn't directly mention the Twilight Hermit Order, wishing that he could answer another question based on this topic in the future. Katlia bowed and expressed her gratitude before looking at the magician. I wish to obtain clues regarding the direct descendants of the Abraham family. 1,000 pounds. She had no psychological burden when it came to offering a price, as Queen Mystic could definitely provide compensation for her. Why did you directly look at me? She already knows that my teacher is a member of the Abraham family? Furs was first alarmed before realizing that it was nothing surprising. This was because this matter wasn't a secret to the other members of the Tarot Club apart from Ma'am Hermit. It was very normal for them to mention it after completing a transaction with her. Although 1,000 pounds was very attractive, Furs didn't plan on selling information on her teacher. In all her life, there were only a handful of people who had been truly sincere to her. Therefore, she cherished such relationships. After some deliberation, Furs asked, "Why are you looking for them? If you can provide a reason, I can pass the message. As for any further developments, it will depend on them. I have no say on those matters." Indeed, she might appear ordinary, but she actually conceals many secrets. She's a lady who's cautious and meticulous. Katlia sighed inwardly as she said with a nod, "That's very reasonable. I'm searching for the direct descendants of the Abraham family in the hopes of obtaining information on Mr. Dorr. Pass this message to them and see if there's a chance for cooperating. Well, just for passing on the message, I'll pay you 350 pounds. If they're willing to take up the matter, I'll pay another 650 pounds. Furs held back for a full second before answering, "Deal." After saying that, she came to realize the hidden meaning behind Ma'am Hermit's words. Mr. Dorr is related to the Abraham family? That's right. My bracelet came from Ma'am Elisa, and it came from the Abraham family. Yes. Teacher still doesn't know that I'm aware he's part of the Abraham family. I can only casually mention it in my letters that someone was searching for the direct descendants of the Abraham family at a particular gathering, and that it has something to do with Mr. Dorr. I wonder what kind of reaction teacher will have. At this point, Miss Justice was happy for her friend, sensing that her friend had escaped the predicament of being broke. Furs is already sequence 7. She has almost caught up to me. I have to become a hypnotist as soon as possible. As she had such thoughts, she glanced at the Tarot Club members, wishing that they had clues to the fruit of an illusory chime tree. Miss Justice's gaze really makes it hard to say no. Furs lowered her head in embarrassment. This was because she had yet to obtain any clues regarding the fruit of an illusory chime tree in her circles. Sitting across from Audrey, Alger thought for 2 seconds and said, "I have clues, but it will take 2 weeks before I can obtain it." He did have clues. A long time ago, he had discovered an illusory chime tree when he entered the primitive island with Kalangos. But due to his lacking strength, he didn't attempt to approach it. And now, He had the chance of advancing to Sequence 5. He naturally didn't want to give up any opportunities for making money. After all, he still owed Admiral of Stars for the information of the Obninsks. As for why he was mentioning it now, in a sense it was to declare his rights. When the time came, he and the world would explore together. It was best to decide the splitting of the spoils ahead of time to prevent any conflict. Of course, when dealing with the illusory chime tree, it was likely that Gehrman Sparrow would idly stand at the side without rendering any assistance. No problem. Audrey was delighted, and she didn't even ask for a price. She was already beginning to consider finding an excuse or a reason to directly buy it from the psychology alchemists after returning to Backlund in June. With the 2 transactions coming to an end, due to none of the other members having any requests for the time being, Katlia repeated her search for the blood of a mythical creature, and Emlyn once again mentioned that he was searching for the remaining 4 believers of the primordial moon. Then, the tarot gathering entered the free exchange segment. Derek very naturally said, "I've already become a notary." "You don't have to tell us that." The hanged man had the urge to facepalm, but he replied with a calm voice. Although a notary will receive a massive boost in one's physical attributes, it's still more of a support role. If the notarization of a power is valid, you'll have them temporarily enhanced. If the notarization is invalid, the beyonder powers will be forcefully dispersed. At the same time, a notary is good at creating contracts. Once a signature is provided as confirmation, even a Sequence 5 cannot violate it. Even if a Sequence 4 demigod tries to forcefully violate the contract, they will have to pay quite a price. As a member of the Church of Storms, it was one of the basics for him to know the strengths and weaknesses of the Sun pathway. Therefore, Alger carefully explained the exact situation for Little Sunday. He also reminded him to select a mystical item that was good at controlling a target. If there wasn't any, it was best to select something with powerful offensive strength. "Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man." Derek thanked him from the bottom of his heart. Deep down, in the entire Tarot Club, he felt that the greatest and most respectable person was Mr. Fool, and the most impressive person to strive for as a role model was Mr. World. And the most reliable and kind person was none other than wise Mr. Hanged Man. Towards this, Emlyn thought, "This fellow has actually caught up to me. No, I can't be surpassed by him. I need to complete the hunting competition as soon as possible to get the rewards." He contemplated for a few seconds, and after receiving Mr. Fool's permission, he conjured the thin moon puppet that resembled a wooden pole. "Ladies and gentlemen, does anyone of you know what this is?" He knew that Mr. Fool was definitely aware of the answer, but he temporarily didn't have anything he could use for an equal exchange with this mighty existence. Therefore, he could only rely on the other members of the Tarot Club for any answers. "Isn't this the puppet I saw at that gathering?" Mr. Moon already found his target. Furs similarly waited for others to give an answer out of curiosity. Katlia carefully observed it before frowning. "It's likely a moon envoy. It's a beyonder item that primordial moon believers create by using a bloody ritual that spans centuries. It's said to be imbued with divine powers. Each one of them possesses an unimaginable horror. Where did you obtain it from? It's very dangerous. It's best that you hand it over to the upper echelons of the Sanguine." Emlyn changed his sitting posture and chuckled. "I encountered it when hunting the primordial moon believer. She's already dead, while I'm still alive." Mr. Moon's flaunting of himself is really obvious. The senior spectator, Audrey, chuckled inwardly. Katlia was taken aback. Without deliberately hiding anything, she asked, "How did you do it? Did the upper echelons of the Sanguine provide you with assistance?" Emlyn gaped, somewhat at a loss for words. Only then did he realize that this topic wasn't suitable for a deeper discussion. Ahem. He cleared his throat and looked towards the end of the long bronze table. "I sought help from Mr. Fool." Chapter 768. Conversation between smart people sought help from Mr. Fool? "You can do that?" Katlia was stunned by what she heard. Having been punished and discovering that his blessed Gehrman Sparrow was becoming more and more impressive, she no longer had any doubts regarding Mr. Fool's status or abilities. She even knew that when Mr. Fool pulled her in through the use of an ancient item, allowing her to escape the pursuit of knowledge, she had come to realize that he was in existence at least at the level of the hidden sage or primordial moon. However, for certain reasons, he wasn't able to interfere with the real world, making her suspect him to be an ancient god that was undergoing an awakening process. The moon's words left her surprised that Mr. Fool was able to provide substantial help to the Tarot Club members, and wasn't just someone who could only provide knowledge or pull them above the gray fog. On the one hand, this means that in times of danger, I can also pray directly to Mr. Fool for help. This is more ridiculous than any ritual. On the other hand, it reveals the fact that Mr. Fool's recovery process is faster than I had imagined. Many thoughts instantly flashed through Katlia's mind. Audrey, Derek, and company weren't that surprised. They had more or less sought Mr. Fool's help in the past, and they had even witnessed the angel under this great existence. Seeing everyone's gaze fall on him, Emlyn shrank his neck as he lifted his chin. I paid a price. It was a fair and equal exchange. Fair and equal exchange. A mighty existence's immediate and effective response is priceless. Katlia couldn't help but retort inwardly. She didn't directly say it, because she too wished to use the opportunity of such a fair and equal exchange in the future. It would imply that she would have an additional life compared to others. Furs was quite puzzled by Mr. Moon's deliberate emphasis on the principle of fair and equal exchange. Everyone who had sought Mr. Fool's help had made a corresponding payment. Mr. Moon sure is a man who cares about his reputation. No, a sanguine. Audrey seriously evaluated Emlyn's emotional changes that happened over a span of seconds. As the exchange continued, the tarot gathering slowly came to an end. After returning to the City of Silver, Derek first recalled a notary's strengths and weaknesses mentioned by Mr. Hanged Man. Then, he once again headed for the Twin Towers that was north of the city to select a mystical item. He didn't do this before, because his condition wasn't stable after advancing. He was worried that making contact with a mystical item would lead to him losing control. Inside the spire, Derek Berg listed his requirements after finishing the paperwork. He saw a filtered list of items and obtained the corresponding documents that contained the information. After having a careful read and observation period, he quickly narrowed down the choices to two. The first was Cardi's ring. It was ancient and simple in appearance, and it was completely iron black in color. It was engraved with dark and complicated patterns. It was left behind by a resident of the City of Silver a long time ago. It could aid the wearer in awing a target, causing them to stop. It could also make ordinary humans temporarily lose their reason, or it could awaken the hidden emotions and memories of a crazy monster, allowing them to enter a brief period of confusion in which they wouldn't deliver any attacks. The other item was Thunder God's Roar. It was obtained from a city that was in ruins. It was rather heavy and resembled a sledgehammer. It was dark blue in color while silver lightning swirled around it. Holding its handle felt like holding the leg bone of a creature. It could produce sounds that left the enemy in fear and chaos while in combat, as though a thunder god had descended upon the ground as heap kept roaring. Every strike brought with it a potent destructiveness with no lack of terrifying lightning. The negative effect of Cardi's ring was that the wearer would unknowingly produce another self. Therefore, one needed to periodically receive treatment from a psychianalyst. If there were any mistreatments, then it could result in the aggravation of the problem, making it harder to treat. And eventually, the two selves would enter a fight, ultimately leading to losing control. In contrast, Thunder God's Roar didn't have that many latent risks. It would only make the user be a little irascible bit by bit. As long as one periodically vented their emotions, there wouldn't be a problem. However, it also had another side effect. In a completely dark environment, the chances of being attacked by terrifying monsters from the depths of darkness was 100%. The chances of being attacked is 100%. Upon seeing this number, Derek turned gloomy. This meant that many City of Silver residents had vanished because of this reason. They were the former owners of Thunder God's Roar. Which should I choose? Generating another self is terrifying. Miss Justice has mentioned before that it's called dissociative identity disorder. Thunder God's Roar not only has a power that affects the enemy's state, but it also has a rather powerful offensive capability. My axe of hurricane has been used too many times, so it will likely be damaged ahead of time. I can produce light by myself, so I don't have to be worried about absolute darkness. Derek thought for a moment and pointed at the dark blue sledgehammer. I want Thunder God's Roar. 160 Buckland Street. Klein walked out of his master bedroom and saw butler Walter waiting for him with a few invitation letters in hand. Sir, there are a total of 3 invitations this week. There's an afternoon tea session on Wednesday, a literary salon on Friday, and a banquet on Saturday. They were sent from. Klein listened with a warm expression before saying with a smile, Tell these friendly inviters that I'll be participating. All right, sir. Walter bowed and left the 3rd story. Seeing the figure disappear from the stairwell, Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. After another week of such invitations, it will be my turn to invite my neighbors for a banquet or a ball. By repeating this act of inviting others and being invited, I'll really enter their circles and would be recommended by them to important figures at even higher levels. I'll be able to enter different clubs. Heh. Such recommendations are definitely established on a foundation of having sufficient wealth. A person without any value wouldn't be recommended. Socializing for high society is truly troublesome. It'll take at least another month before I'll get to make contact with people who were slightly involved in the great smog of Backlund. The church is easier. As long as there's enough donations and enough piousness, I'll be able to freely enter and exit to listen to the bishop's preachings. Of course, that's on the premise I pass the investigation. If everything goes well, I'll be able to figure out the rotation schedule of the keepers and find a chance to go behind Cheney's gate. Klein reined in his thoughts as he instructed his valet, Richardson, to bring him his coat, hat and cane. According to his schedule, he was to head to the Royal Grand Theatre to see the most popular play, The Betrayer's Ring, in recent times. This isn't solely for entertainment. It's to understand the popular plays, famous music, and trending novels. Only then could he have a common topic of conversation at the various high society gatherings. Being a popular gentleman must be tiring. Behind a 1-minute performance lies 10 years of hard work. Social gatherings such as these are really exhausting. As Klein lampooned, he allowed Richardson to help him wear a coat before he sat in his high-end four-wheeled carriage. He headed for the Royal Grand Theatre in Westborough, where he had a luxurious box to himself, and watched The Betrayer's Ring. It's different from television and movies. A play's acting is more exaggerated and impactful. Yes, this is determined by the acting environment. The story isn't bad. But why does it seem familiar? Don't tell me that it's a story adapted from Emperor Rosel's works. These are likely famous play actors. The papers have mentioned them before. It's said that they're very popular, just like celebrities on Earth during the age of the internet. As long as I participate in the gatherings of high society, I'll definitely have the opportunity of meeting them. As Klein watched the play, he habitually lampooned inwardly. Sherwood Borough, at the ticket booth of a large theater. Melissa, who finally had her turn, pushed the notes and coins through the booth window and said, "The Betrayer's Ring. 2 tickets. 3 p.m. on Sunday." After watching The Betrayer's Ring, Klein sat in his carriage as he sipped a cup of black tea and received the evening papers that Richardson had purchased. He first flipped through the play's critic column, and he found the comments from some professional critics. He compared their reviews to his own, and he gradually formulated a unique and profound experience. Yes, at the very least, it's enough to fool those ladies and gentlemen. After Klein finished his homework, he leisurely read the papers and was surprised to find a piece of news. The Backlund Bike Company's 10% shares have been sold. Further inquiries won't be entertained. It's done? By publishing this piece of news, it means Mr. Isengard has already received the money. Klein was first delighted before he frowned slightly. His gaze landed on the exclamation mark at the end. The information was indeed what he and Isengard Stanton had agreed upon ahead of time, but he found that exclamation mark was rather harsh on the eyes. Such a statement doesn't need an exclamation mark. Mr. Isengard is a person who pays attention to details. He wouldn't give the papers free rein. He deliberately left the exclamation to pass a message? He's giving a warning? While pondering, Klein suddenly realized something. The 10% shares which Isengard Stanton sold are obviously from Sherlock Moriarty. With the former's character, he wouldn't sell it for no reason. In a certain sense, this means that Sherlock Moriarty or his proxy has returned to Backlund. Therefore, one of the factions of the royal family that was involved with the Great Smog of Backlund had acutely noticed the situation and has begun monitoring Detective Isengard Stanton, hoping to capture the person who heads over to claim the cash. How should I get the money? Klein seemed to naturally read the papers as he began seriously considering the pertinent question. Chapter 769. Sacrificing to Oneself 10 at night. Backlund was drizzling again as a thin fog produced a blurry sense of beauty amidst the street lamps. Isengard Stanton's assistant, Bowen, surveyed the bottom level once before walking to the side of the oriel window and was prepared to shut the final window. At that moment, a shadow scuttled in and landed firmly on the protruding wall. It was a blue, short-furred stray cat. Bowen saw the large pair of yellow eyes looking at him as he couldn't help but chuckle. There's no food here. As a detective's work made him prone to revenge, and him having many secrets to hide, Isengard Stanton's cook and servants were paid by the hour. There were a fixed number of hours a day, and they wouldn't prepare too much food. This made it difficult for there to be any leftovers after dinner. The blue cat opened its mouth but didn't produce any meowing sounds. It began speaking like a human. I'm Sherlock Moriarty. I'm here to meet Mr. Isengard Stanton. Although Bowen was a Beyonder who was nurtured by the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, he was a low-sequence Beyonder and his horizons were stilted. This was the first time he was encountering a speaking cat, so he was momentarily shocked and dazed. After a few seconds, he came to his senses and recalled what the cat had just said. It said it's Sherlock Moriarty? This great detective really isn't simple. He actually changed into a cat. No, controlled a cat. Such powers are really strange and terrifying. Bowen rapidly calmed down and didn't directly answer the cat. He reached out to close the windows. After doing all of this, he said with a suppressed voice, "Follow me." The cat immediately leaped from the platform behind the oriel window as it agilely followed behind Bowen with its tail up. It followed him all the way to the second story and watched him knock on Isengard Stanton's bedroom door. Is there something? Isengard, who was dressed in pajamas with faint lines, opened the door and asked. He was just enjoying his tobacco before sleeping. Bowen cautiously pointed to the crouched blue cat beside him. Mr. Sherlock Moriarty is looking for you. Isengard, with his white sideburns and thin face, raised his brows slightly and looked down. He took 2 steps back and allowed the blue cat to saunter into his bedroom. Return to your room and get some sleep. Wake up as per normal tomorrow. We still have a case awaiting us. Isengard instructed Bowen as though nothing had happened. After his assistant left him, he closed the door and turned to look at the blue cat who was sitting beside the reclining chair. He chuckled. I never expected you to have such Beyonder powers. I was worried you would directly come over. I noticed your exclamation mark, the cat said with a smile. It had to be said that having such an expression show on a cat's face was rather odd. It left anyone who witnessed it feel a chill run down their back. Isengard didn't react abnormally towards that as he sucked at his pipe, sat on a reclining chair, and slowly exhaled in comfort. He said with a smile, I trust your intelligence. Thank you for your compliments. The cat politely reached out its paws and bowed. Isengard observed it and rubbed its pipe while smiling. You should have understood what is happening. Those people don't dare to monitor me too strictly, afraid that I would discover them and end up telling the Church of Evernight and the Church of Steam. Heh. So even though it will be quite troublesome for them if they get exposed, I believe that they have a demigod among them. This is a deduction and is also based on certain feedback. After all, I've lived on this street for years. Therefore, humans and animals wouldn't be stopped from entering my house. I believe you've already figured that out. But when leaving, you'll definitely be tailed and tracked. Do you have the means to evade their tracking? The sum of money isn't a small one. Bringing it out would be quite conspicuous. Let me think. Were you planning on conferring with me in order to get me to deposit the money into a particular bank account, and then you'll find many people to withdraw them in different parts of Backland? Upon saying that, Isengard said with a self-deprecating smile, This is the best solution I can think of, but carrying it out would be extremely troublesome. The cat didn't give a direct response as it gave a deep chuckle. I only need you to lend me an empty room and 3 candles. No problem. Isengard didn't press the issue as he said. The shares were sold for £12,000. The buyer is the daughter of Earl Hall, Audrey. Well, the hiring of lawyers and accountants, as well as the publishing of the advertisements cost a total of £600. In addition, there was a 0.5% stamp duty and 20% D-type taxes. So at the end of the day, there's only £8,940 left. D-type taxes were a tax on commercial, financial, and specialized income. There's tax. More than £2,000 are gone just like that. The cat's expression instantly froze. Klein was formerly a nighthawk, and his salary was tax-free. Later, as a private detective, his income was difficult to be monitored, so he never declared his income for tax purposes. Later, he became an adventurer, and since the bounties targeted at pirates enjoyed concessions, there was no need for him to pay taxes on them. Hence, he never realized that tax was something he needed to pay. Therefore, back when Isengard Stanton had mentioned taxes, he hadn't taken it to heart, believing that it wouldn't be much. However, reality had given him a heavy beating. As for why there weren't any taxes for the share transaction the previous time, taxes were waived by the lone government for initial investments related to inventions, as a way to foster inventions. After a brief silence, the cat's whiskers moved as it said, "All right, give me the cash. Move it to the empty room. There's no problems with the money, right? I've already checked them. They wouldn't do any cheap tricks on that, as it would be an insult to my intelligence." Isengard stood up with his pipe. "Remember to send me a signed letter of confirmation by mail later." "It's already on its way," the cat replied, prepared. Isengard walked to the safe inside the master bedroom, using a passcode and key to open it. Then, he took out stacks of cash, and he stuffed them into different briefcases. Following that, he left the master bedroom with these briefcases and entered a guest room diagonally opposite the master bedroom. "Check it." Isengard placed the briefcases filled with cash on the ground as he said to the cat that followed him in. "I trust you," the cat said after taking a few glances. Isengard nodded and pointed to the cabinet. "There are candles inside." With that said, he left the door, held the doorknob, and said with a smile, "I'm really curious how you would leave. I believe it will be a very exciting magic show." Isengard Stanton closed the door with a click, leaving the guest room silent and bleak. At the cat's side, a figure dressed in a dark red coat and an old triangular hat appeared. It was none other than Klein's marionette, Wraith Senior. He found the candles and quickly set up a simple altar. Skipping over many of the first few steps, he directly muttered in Elvish, "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rørsted archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua. Your devoted servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to take his offerings. I pray for you to open the gates to your kingdom." The wind inside the wall of spirituality suddenly grew in intensity as Senor quickly sliced the back of his hand and threw out a few drops of blood. As a Sequence 5 wraith, everything on him was material that was rich in spirituality. The strong wind sucked up the blood, howling as it drilled into the candle flame that symbolized sea god Calvetua. The flame burgeoned, forming an illusory door filled with magic labels and symbols. After about 10 seconds, the door let out a heavy creak as it slowly opened. One by one, Senor lifted up the briefcases filled with money and threw them into the illusory door. When there was almost none left, the gold coin he stored in his body flew out and landed on the altar. The wraith's figure then disappeared, projecting onto the smooth side of the gold coin. The gold coin trembled as it flew up, hitched a ride on the briefcase ahead of it, and entered the illusory door of sacrifice. Silently, the mysterious door closed as the 3 candlelight were restored to normal. At this moment, the blue short-furred cat seemed to recover its senses. It looked around blankly as it meowed. After a while, Isengard opened the door and entered, finding all the briefcases with the cash gone. There were only 3 candles burning silently as the blue short-furred cat was warily arching its back at him. While he scrutinized this scene, a rental carriage slowly drove past on the fork on the other end of the street. On the same night, in a building inside Cherwood Borough, Zio returned home under the drizzle. As she wiped her hair with a towel, she said to Furs, "Your letter has been mailed." Furs tersely answered as she began to guess when her teacher would respond. At this moment, Zio put down the towel and quipped, "There's news about Mr. X's gathering. It'll still be at the same place on Friday night." "Great. I can tell Mr. World. I wonder how much I'll need to pay." Furz's eyes lit up when she heard that. Before she could ask about the details, Zio added, "Mr. X also gave a mission that said to have handsome rewards. It's to inform him of people around them who have abnormal luck." "People with abnormal luck?" Furs muttered in puzzlement. Is this man's brain working? Who would divulge things around them at such a gathering? This will make it easy for others to discover their true identities. Who knows? Perhaps he really is a lunatic. Zio didn't know anyone with abnormal luck, so she answered without much thought. Furs carefully thought for a moment, but she failed to figure out the true intentions behind this mission. All she could do was throw it to the back of her mind. She planned on praying to Mr. Fool once Zio went to take a bath, passing the relevant information to the World Gehrman Sparrow. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.